welcome to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky.
I'm Steven Zuber.
And this week we have with us Andrew Cutler.
Hey, everyone.
Andrew, you are the guy who wrote the snake cult theory series of posts that we talked about last time, yes?
Yep.
And you contacted us to say, hey, if you want to talk to me personally about this kind of stuff, please feel free to do so. And we said, heck yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So today I kind of want to, maybe go over some of the snake cult stuff from before. I think we got a lot of the main gist of it. And so I don't want to retread a lot of old ground from a recent episode. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of other tangential questions and just pick your brain on things in general. This is a follow-up to our episode on the snake cult theory of consciousness, which aired 3 episodes back, I think. So listen to that one first if you didn't listen to it, because otherwise you may not know what the heck we're talking about a lot of the time. We don't recover a lot of the ground from that previous episode since it was so recently in the past.
Yeah, we maybe briefly summarize it, but all too briefly. And it wasn't worth trying to rehash because there's so much new stuff to talk about, as you can tell by the link of the episode.
But before we get into all that, I think we should probably start with you saying, hey, you guys got something totally wrong, and I want to clarify something. Was there anything we got totally wrong that you want to clarify?
No, that's actually partly why I reached out. As a listener, it was a very good experience to hear your podcast. It was exactly what I meant to communicate. And there were a lot of moments where you would say, hey, I don't know exactly what Andrew would think, but modeling his opinion, this is what I think. And it was surprisingly accurate, which given a blog post is fairly lossy. I was surprised at how well you were modeling that.
That was delightful to read. You put that in a comment, and I had no expectation that you'd hear the episode or anything. So it's nice to hear that our guesses were close enough to spot on to not be annoying, but no, hearing that they were close enough to be pleasant was nice. How did you find out about the episode? Did someone send it your way, or?
I may have contacted you directly to ask if it was okay to put an audio version of the post up.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
A large part of the credit for us getting what you were saying should go directly to you. You write in a very easy to understand, very personable style, which just gets across your point, I think. I dislike the highly academic style of writing because it seems to intentionally obfuscate things for the purposes of sounding like all highfalutin and fancy. I much prefer when people just talk to me directly. In large part, it helps to make things clear and understood, exactly as you did with your posts. So thank you.
On that, I feel like I draw a lot from Scott Alexander. It's difficult to know what readers know or even kind of who you're talking to, so kind of developing an audience. When I wrote the snake piece, my blog is a psychometrics blog, and so most of the people are kind of academic psychologists or adjacent. And so I was writing to a very general audience on something that's kind of like esoteric Christianity, anthropology. I kind of model just let's talk to like the modal Slate Star Codex reader, because that's who I'm most comfortable talking to, which is also partly why I'm here, because you guys, you're not exactly the modal Slate Star Codex reader, but you definitely understand that style of communication.
I don't know if that means that we're dumber than the average Slate Star Codex reader.
We're adjacent.
No, I'm saying you're super readers.
Oh, well, I do read every post. I guess the modal reader probably doesn't read every post that he puts up.
I'm the modal reader then.
Okay.
You also have this great way of writing. Anyone who, your writing style is so evocative. The first example, just in this one, we don't have to dive right in. I just wanted to grab this before I forgot, was it says, my thesis is that women discovered, quote unquote, I first, and then taught men about inner life. Creation myths are memories of when women forged human minds into a dualistic species. That sounds fantastic, but we must have to have evolved at some point, parenthetically, and it must have been fantastic. I love that. It sounds fantastic, but man, it must have been, right? Like that just comes through so well.
To use a computer science analogy, I don't know if people are familiar with generative adversarial networks, or GANs.
Let's go ahead and assume that the baseline listener is not.
What those are, and so if you're going to use Dolly or Midjourney, they create images basically from the ether. And one of the problems is if you just generate images, if you don't take any risks, the image you generate should be just gray, because that's kind of the average for every single pixel. And so you just kind of like, if you average over every possibility, you end up with something that's, it's not a real image, right? It's just a grayscale or random noise. But if you want to make an image, say, of like a snake dancing, then you have to take a lot of risks on individual pixels. And I think something similar happens with human origins, that it must have been crazy. Like there must have been some uncanny valley, but to get that right, you have to take a lot of risks on the specifics. And so that's kind of what I was trying to get at with that.
What do you mean by take risks on the specifics? As in our brain was taking risks, or as in coming up with theories on what happened?
Oh, the theory. So the model. So whatever actually did happen, there's a bunch of models of what happened. And if you just take the average of that, you get something kind of boring. But if you take each model of something that actually could have happened, many of those are crazy. And it has to do with, I don't say just the diffusion of creation myths is kind of a crazy thing, or the diffusion of pronouns, that there could be cognates between, I don't know, Australian languages and Basque.
I love your idea. I love almost everything you've written. I read the Eve Theory of Consciousness Part 3, and it is by far like the most in-depth of any of them. I don't know, it's got to be at least 40,000 words. Like this thing is huge. It brought together a lot of things you're saying and laid them all together in one place. But also, especially when you were like in the weak theory part, it felt watered down. It wasn't nearly as like sink its fangs into me and shake me around with these cool new ideas. It almost felt like more like a science paper, which I hate that sounds so negative, because obviously you have to do that to talk to these science people. And also it's still really fucking cool. But the stuff that got me was when you were, really into the crazy myths and pulling things together. And like, dude, can you imagine what it would be like if the people around you are not conscious and you're the only one and you don't even know what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer to that. I don't know the best way to develop the idea. I like basically that's what we're doing here, because you do like what's the path forward for the idea. I what I wanted with that is basically to write it as formally as I could, to try and say like what is different than other ideas, and hope somebody like Scott Alexander thinks that there's merit to it, and then kind of continue the debate, which I mean this is definitely a part of that. But yeah, I'm all ears for how people think it should be developed, because I'm really just one dude on the internet.
It really does feel like if you want to get it out there in academic circles, you got to write like the stodgy writing. I prefer, the thing is, I don't know if I'm supposed to be your audience, because I read the fucking sequences, and those are famous for being hard to like get into, because they're just a fuck ton of blog posts on the internet that you have to read for hours and crawl through and everything. And it's almost like speaking of mystery cults, it's almost like a mystery cult where you have to find this knowledge and kind of make it your own. And that makes it fun, but that also makes it really illegible and inscrutable for others. And so like I really enjoyed trawling your blog and getting all these individual posts and putting them together in my head, but that makes it kind of illegible for the wider academic audience. They can't just like have one big post that they refer to and say, look at this post, guys, isn't this interesting? And I think like Eve Theory of Consciousness Part 3 actually does that. So it's probably a good thing in the end to have just the one big omnibus master post that's like, here's all of it, go to town, college people.
On the topic of developing the idea, one of the things I haven't pursued it as much as I probably should, I'd like to write a little bit for Seeds of Science, which is a scientific journal that's somewhat Slate Star Codex adjacent. At least it received a grant from Scott. And it's basically, I mean, it is what it sounds. It's seeds of science. So there's like a kernel of a big idea, and you don't have to write quite as academic. People like Robin Hanson have written there. And so I want to peel off smaller portions of the idea. For example, that snake venom is an entheogen, and just write an article just on that, or that initiation rituals diffused. I probably have enough to say about that.
For people who don't know, what is an entheogen?
It literally means God within. So it's a hallucinogen that's used in a ritual setting. So like mushrooms are the prototypical example.
Has it not been accepted? Is it not thought that snake venom counts as one of these?
It doesn't appear on any list. Like when you look up entheogens, it doesn't appear on the list. But there is David Hillman. He's a classicist that did a PhD in entheogens, and he's written a couple papers arguing the Greeks use snake venom as an entheogen. That's been cited by Carl Ruck, who's the guy who coined the phrase entheogen. So he's a very big name. It's kind of diffuse, somewhat, it seems like common knowledge, because I found a lot of papers going back to maybe 2000 in a subset of classics where they'd make the claim that, like, at Delphi, that they were consuming snake venom to achieve higher states of consciousness. But a lot of those wouldn't cite anything, which is very strange. They just say, like, oh yeah, like as if other people would know. And so it actually took me a long time to track down the sources that had made that claim before.
Speaking of, I guess, the investigative journey of tracking down these sources and stuff, everyone at some point wants to grapple with the question, where did we come from? And, there's various answers to various degrees of satisfaction. I think then the road for a lot of people, especially in our circles, is like, well, something replicating a molecule, throw in some time and you get people. And that's an answer, but this tackles that question from a different direction. When people ask, where did we come from? It didn't really articulate for me until I was reading these. That it's like, it's not so much that I care like where bipedal, partially haired hominids came from, right? It's like, where did I come from? The conscious person, the entity that's asking this question. And it's driving that more directly towards that the core of that search that I think every human goes through. What was it that drove you to think about this so much and give it so much consideration?
Well, I think I'll give the long answer to that.
Yes.
Which at the beginning I neglected to kind of introduce my background, but this is as good a place as any to do that. So I have a PhD in electrical engineering, and what I studied actually was personality structure. And so there's a very old idea back to the 1890s by Francis Galton. It's called the lexical hypothesis. Everybody kind of wanted to know, like, what's the structure of personality, or how do we enumerate all of the facets of personality? One person can try and do that, but he had this idea. He's like, hey, we have language. When you're gossiping or when you're trying to describe someone else, implicitly you need a word to do that. And so all of the individual differences between people, the important ones, will get a personality adjective that describes it. And so you can just make a list of all the personality adjectives, and then personality, the structure of personality, is somewhere in this list. So the name of my blog is Vectors of Mind, and that comes from an electrical engineer back in the 1930s who moved on to this problem. He wanted to find the personality structure in all of these adjectives. What he did is he constructed an adjacency matrix, so how similar the pairwise similarities between any two personality adjectives. He chose 60, and then he did what's called principal component analysis or factor analysis. Basically, he found out, invented some math or some methods to find out like what's the important factors in all of this. My PhD was taking another look at this problem. Have I lost you yet, or is this how we're doing?
No, we're doing good. Once upon a time, I was a psychology major, so I recognized Francis Galton's name, and I think he was related to Charles Darwin.
Yeah, that's his cousin.
Yeah. And not to bury the lead, but doesn't this kind of end up with the popular Big Five personality traits? Down the road.
You gotta let him walk us to that.
All right, so
no, that's great that you already know. So basically, what they did is
wait. Could I ask a brief question? You said that they got a lot of these from like words people use to describe other people's personalities, which I guess are things like energetic or lazy or outgoing or whatever. You said there were 60 of them that he settled on. Why 60 in particular? Did there start being too many repeats?
Very ad hoc. So for those of you who know Big O notation, it's n cubed to do factor analysis. And so if you make an adjacency matrix that's 60 by 60, what's 60 cubed? That's a lot of computations. And he was bragging. So the dude's a genius. Thurnston was his name. I'm a huge fan. He invented a lot of kind of shortcuts so that he could decompose a 60 by 60 matrix into the constituent factors. And he actually did find 5 is how much he needed. And that was in the 30s. And then the Big Five, they did basically the same thing, except for by that time they had computers, and so they could use more adjectives. And so they just used basically all of the adjectives, or they used 500 or 2,000. So to go into a little bit more detail about how they come up with an adjacency matrix. So what they do is they give a bunch of undergrads or prisoners or whoever they can find a survey. Does this adjective describe you? And then, like, once you have, I don't know, 100 or 1,000 people have done this survey, then you know how often people say if they're energetic, how often they say that they're lazy or something. And so you can find the correlation between any two words. And then it's this correlation matrix that you're doing factor analysis on. So in the 90s, they did this, I don't know, a dozen times or so. And if you squint, you basically always come up with the big five.
Huh.
And so that's where the big five came from.
Can you remind us of what the big five are real quick?
In order of the factors, so like most important to least important, is agreeableness, extroversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and then openness to experience.
Wow.
If you know where they kind of exist on all those five axes, you don't lose very much information about where they exist on any given word in the dictionary.
Got it. Neat. All right. Thank you. Sorry. Please continue.
So how they constructed those surveys or the correlation matrix is really flawed, right? They were literally using undergrads or psych students from the University of Oregon in 1990. And so super, super weird sample. And what I realized is, hey, this is just an adjacency matrix. We have language models. Why don't we pull out like the correlations between words from language models? And so at the time, Roberta and Bert, those were the state of the art. And so my dissertation was constructing, like using language models to make this adjacency matrix. And then you do factor analysis and you come out with a very, very similar structure.
Roberta and Bert, I don't recognize those names. Where are they on the GTP 1 through 4 spectrum? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, so they use transformers, but it's a slightly different architecture. They don't just predict the next word. They can predict any word in a sentence. And so it's a slightly different architecture.
Oh, interesting.
That was the state of the art then.
Do you know what power of generation roughly that would be comparable to?
Yeah, so definitely before 2. So they have, if I recall, like 300 million parameters, and they're up to something like 1 trillion now. But they're very, very good language models. After my dissertation, I wrote this up in a much better paper because I found a collaborator who worked in personality psychology, and then he and I wrote up a paper.
And what did the paper argue?
Basically, it was a really long paper. It was like 70 pages. We just did a ton of experiments showing, like, basically there's nothing up our sleeves. We really did come up with the same structure using a very, very different method. But all of this is to answer your question of how was I coming at this? I spent kind of years staring at what was kind of the big five. So it's not exactly the big five. I'm papering over some stuff. So they do what's called Varimax rotation. So you get these, after PCA, you get a set of factors, but the first factor is much more important than the second factor is much more important than the third. So to kind of even out the importance, they do what's called Varimax rotation. And so agreeableness isn't hugely more important than, say, neuroticism. However, if you just used principal component factor 1, the first factor would be much more than the fourth. And so I was looking at these personality factors, and the way I thought about them was, hey, how humans evolved was language and basically being in the good graces of the tribe. And so this really is a map of human evolution, especially the first factor. I had a blog which was just kind of exploring the connections between psychology and machine learning. And something I got asked fairly often was, okay, so you found 5 factors which were kind of like the big 5. Like, what were those factors? And I'd honestly never even tried to describe them because I'm an engineer and not a psychologist. And I don't know, it's not my lane. It's not what I'm particularly good at either. But I was just like, hey, it's a blog. I'm going to try and describe these factors, like the 1, 2, 3, 4 that aren't the big 5. So I realized the first one is by far the most important, and it's all about social navigation. And I wrote an article calling it the golden rule factor, treating others like you'd like to be treated. So it's about being kind, thoughtful, diplomatic, intelligent. So it's all the socially good stuff. And then on the flip side is, I don't know, stuff like ungenerous, unkind, gossipy, patricidal. I was just kind of theorizing about what this is, and I'd always thought about it in evolutionary terms. And so I wrote an article about, like, okay, what would this cause us to evolve? And it seemed very clear, like it would cause us to evolve a conscience. Like there's the selection factor
Mm.
is for a conscience. I was thinking, like, this is weird because language has only existed for like 50 or 100,000 words, but your conscience, at least how people think of it, like, I don't know, like in Christianity, they'll say like a still small voice, the Holy Spirit, or it's often connected to some sort of like inner voice.
Okay.
And so it's just weird that such a big part of our evolution, which was for a conscience, happened so recently, if language and therefore inner voice is recent or is in the past 50,000 years. And so I was just kind of playing with this idea, and the leap I made was, hey, it's actually really hard to identify with your inner voice. Like that's the whole ordeal, right? That you have recursion, you have all this stuff, but hallucinating is very, very easy. And so I was like, hey, maybe at the beginning it was like the inner voice could have been hallucinatory. And so that kind of gives you a step where you're just an animal and then you start hallucinating. And it's basically just like this voice that says, share your food or stay on task or whatever. And then the next leap I made was, what would it be like to realize that voice is you? And then I was like, whoa, Genesis is a very, very close match to that. And particularly the thing that got me was, so between this first factor, you can call it emotional intelligence because it correlates about 0.9 with emotional intelligence. In the list of adjectives, one that um, loads a lot on this is feminine, where masculine is neutral. And so there's at least everybody who speaks English kind of agrees that women are farther along on this. And then if you look at emotional intelligence, women score much better on emotional intelligence. So it just seemed like women would have been kind of the vanguard of this process. And then you get Genesis, it's very weird that Adam is just sort of along for the ride. Like really Eve is the actor. I was thinking like, okay, if at some point people realized the inner voice was them, not in infancy, if they did that like as a teenager, then you're in the regime of, okay, this is kind of explained to them over and over again. And if women were before it, then I don't know, 10,000, 50,000 years, maybe you get a story like a kind of a garbled account like Genesis. And so that's the kernel I had like a couple of years ago. So that kernel basically hasn't changed. I think this is the first time I've really told the long story of how I got there. That it definitely was. I was just sort of playing with ideas for no reason. I'm not particularly interested in the question who we are and where we came from. It's just this one this one question of, I really think that we evolved kind of to fit into a tribe. There's just so much evidence for that. It seems connected somehow to identifying with inner voice, or at least having the realization I am, which is a little more general than the inner voice. And it just seems like a reasonable path. And then I started reading, since then I've read probably a dozen books of other accounts of how we got the whole human condition. And I haven't seen anything more compelling than that, where it's having some kind of evolved morality that we then kind of move towards identifying with.
It's interesting that recently on Twitter I saw a lot of inner dialogue, hearing voice discourse. It seems to presuppose that people have like an inner voice that they hear, and I don't know how literal that is, because I don't feel like I hear an actual voice telling me things ever, but I've heard so many people use that language before that now I start to think probably some people actually mean it literally, the same way that, people with aphantasia, or I don't remember the exact word, the inability to see pictures in their mind, right? Thought that anybody who was talking about, I can see this, was speaking metaphorically and not that they could literally picture something. Do you actually like hear a voice ever when you're feeling moral compulsions, or how literal is this? And do you think the early humans had it? There's some social animals out there. Do you think like social animals like dog packs have anything that's similar to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, good questions. I'm not a meditator, but I would like for some meditators to kind of offer their opinion about the relationship of inner voice to self to consciousness. It's definitely not all the same thing. What you're getting at, I do think that there's a lot of loss in the description, where as far as inner voice, I hear it differently than, say, I hear somebody talking to me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've never confused the two.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's obviously a little bit metaphorical, but it's much more literal than, say, so I can't picture anything. And so I always thought that
Mm.
other people were speaking metaphorically, like, oh, your mind's eye. I was 30 before I realized, like, what other people, like, actually can picture something in their brain. Because I mean, I am much more linguistic than I am like, I'm an awful drawer, but I can write. So I think that there's something like it definitely does have something to do with your predisposition. But also, I'm quite confident it can be trained. So the one thing that it's somewhat easy for me to visualize is calculus. And
Mm.
I think that's just because it made calculus much easier. If you're doing especially an integral, if you just imagine the shape and then you imagine if it's a 3D shape and you're putting a 2D plane, you're dragging that through it, that really helps you visualize, or it really helps you understand how big the volume is. And so that was like, for some reason, the one exception. But Apple, I guess it never became that useful for me to visualize an apple, but calculus, yeah.
Yeah. No one visualizes an apple. I think it's a terrible example. I always tell people like try to visualize boobs or your partner's face or something that you actually like spend time visualizing sometimes.
Apple might be a good example just to see if someone really just they're like, yeah, I can describe an apple, but I can't see it in my mind's eye. I think that is a good quick test though.
Yeah, but I think apple is an actual exercise. Like I have to dedicate some mind space to visualize an apple.
See, I don't.
Oh no?
You say the word apple, and I've immediately got a picture of a red delicious with a stem and the little glisten on the right side of it. Like, so that's how my brain correlates words to pictures, I guess. And I do have good mental imagery.
Like I can see things exploding into shreds like at a moment's notice. That is super easy for me. But maybe I spent way too much time pretending I was in action movies when I was a kid.
You know, that might be more useful than picturing apples. But
Highly doubt it.
as far as the inner voice, because you and I talked about this briefly before. I liked the way that Andrew put it. It's like I've never confused it with someone else's voice, whether it's someone else in the room or someone else speaking directly to my brain. I always know it's my mind. I think an easy example to generate is when you have the opportunity to do something unethical but get away with it, or something that you don't want to do but you could get away with it. That the tip jar at the counter is unattended, and you're like, I could grab $10, but I shouldn't. Like, there's that voice in your head, whether it's a voice or an articulate enough feeling to put words to, that's kind of a moral injunction. And I like that because I feel like that's kind of the same kind of example that might have been some of the earliest thoughts that people might have had in the quote unquote I sense, right?
Yeah. Well, when I think through things, I'm often, almost always thinking with words, right? But I don't know, the idea that your conscience was initially a hallucination, you couldn't like have a hallucination like that if you didn't have a literal hearing voice, right? Or am I thinking about this wrong?
I think that it probably was more hallucinatory,
Okay.
like closer to schizophrenia. Although I'm somewhat careful about using that analogy, because I do think schizophrenia is quite different than human psychology was 40,000 years ago.
I could see like how if you have a compulsion to share food or something, it might feel like it's coming from outside of you. Like especially like when you have a compulsion to do something, when you want to punch someone even though you know it's wrong, or I don't know, you want to go up and kiss someone or fondle a boob or something, but you shouldn't. It can feel like something is trying to push you to do it even though you know you should not. And so I could totally see how that kind of feeling could be like there is a god or a spirit or something that is trying to move me to do this thing even though I shouldn't, or conversely trying to move me to share my food with someone even though I don't want to, kind of thing. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, and particularly so in the third version, I articulate it with Freud's vocabulary.
Hmm.
So, kind of what you're describing is id versus superego, right? So, there's desire for food or sex or whatever would be id. And then there's this superego, which is the I shouldn't, usually for like moral or social reasons.
Hmm.
And then there's some node which is responsible for resolving that. And even within the id, I mean, you might be hungry and sleepy, and so even there you have to resolve a lot of things. And then also, obviously, superego, like, okay, there's two factions, and then who do you can't please both. There's a lot of resolutions which have to happen. I mean, this is on a very abstract level, but I think that the resolution node became more and more self-referential as it became kind of the center of all of these processes. Kind of what I'm describing is that transition as it becomes self-referential. I think that you get duality with the self-reference, and then kind of all hell breaks loose once you get duality.
The superego makes the choices for moral reasons or social reasons. Is there any difference between moral and social? Because it almost feels like they're the same thing. We just use different words for them.
I feel like the answer to that question would depend on which words you use.
Yeah, I guess optimistically, I think so. I don't know. Do you think? I think about this a little bit in terms of AI risk. That
Mm-hmm.
if moral is just social, we are kind of doomed, right? Because the best replicator will win. But if there is some sort of like ground truth to like cruelty is bad, and I don't know, then then our odds are better. I suppose that I hope moral and social are different.
Oh,
My own take is that they're intertwined enough in the human mind where, even alone on an island, it's hard to think of who you could wrong. But many people, if you did find animals to hunt or whatever, I shouldn't say you probably,
Mhm.
I would still describe it as morally wrong to torture them to death because you're bored. You find other ways to entertain yourself that don't involve suffering, even if you're not concerned about hurting other people. You could say you're social with the animals, but that's not really it. In a way, even in isolation, you're still social with other humans, but there's still something connected to that, but I think distinct that, you could be alone by yourself and say, no, it'd be wrong to do that. You know what I mean?
that's probably that evolved instinct that he was talking about, that it was very evolutionarily useful to have that instinct because we are always in a society, and when we aren't, we die. So you feel that way even if even if it's not technically true. Is this
Yeah.
am I anywhere on the right path here?
Well, for my take, that's why I think it's kind of the same thing. So you're in a social environment even if you're alone because our ancestors were environmental animals.
Andrew, break the tie here.
So I agree with what Stephen just said, that basically that our psychology, it's so wired to think socially that you can't stop thinking socially even if you're alone.
Okay. And all that primarily boils down to the first factor of personality, which was evolved into us for good social survival reasons and became the superego eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so to answer in that group of questions you asked if animals have the
Yeah.
superego. I'm not really sure. The hallucinations, that would really surprise me.
Hmm.
I think that animal models of schizophrenia are not that good. It's like, I don't know, if you Google can dogs get schizophrenia or can animals, it'll say no, only humans can. But that's like kind of the Wikipedia level. I haven't gone that much deeper on it. And so I think it could have been pretty recently in human evolution. I don't know, maybe it's 50, 100,000 years ago that we start getting these hallucinations. I actually do have a little bit to say on why I think it would be good to actually have auditory hallucinations.
Yeah.
So I think it could have started out. So herd animals, they oftentimes have a call for a predator. If your friend like says, "Hey, jaguar," you don't think. You just react to that. And so I do think that there's a very short path between hearing a call and acting. So you could kind of hijack that path yourself if you start producing those calls. Like there's no reason particularly why it would have had to actually be a hallucination, but it kind of makes the stepping stones easier. If you're using a previously built system that was already really fine tuned by years of evolution, because in a group setting, there are going to be calls for predators.
Oh my God. And there could be calls for things like, help me, I need some food or something.
I'm not sure you have to respond very quickly to somebody saying, I need some food. So like you could actually
Okay.
think slowly about these sort of things.
Okay, so they have to be like instinctive. You need fast action calls.
Yeah, well, at least I think the earliest would have been something like that. So it would have been like run.
Yeah.
Maybe when your subconscious notices everything's super quiet, like, hey, why is it? And you just hear this run. So that's actually pretty. I mean, humans feel that. Actually, that exact thing. I mean, why I use that example is because that's fairly common. So there's just, I don't know, you're in a house that you think is haunted, and you're very liable to actually hear a voice say run.
That is fascinating. A lot of animals have mating calls too. The mating calls, do they trigger an instinctive sort of mating response, you think?
I'm not sure. I hadn't thought about that.
And I bet there's a human equivalent.
I think the answer to that is yes and no. I mean, I think there's an important difference between the kind of thing that we're talking about where you imagine a huge evolutionary pressure to have and obey this inner voice that's gives quick commands like duck, move, run, danger, get away. Whereas like the bird out there screaming, I want to have sex is not the same kind of urgent cry. But I was trying to think of whether or not animals have that kind of a version of the superego. And I always think of like dogs, if you've got a well-trained dog and it accidentally pees on the carpet or something, it appears visibly embarrassed.
Oh, yeah.
And not even, I think, necessarily because it's going to be punished. It's just like, I know, I'm really sorry. So it seems to, or if you've ever seen an animal or especially a dog try to, eyeballing your food. And it's like, I wonder if I could grab that before he notices, there's deliberation happening there. Right. And I don't know if it's weighing the pros and cons of like how delicious your sandwich looks versus, how upset you'll be if he eats it or something. But there's definitely cogs turning in there.
I disagree with the word deliberation.
Okay.
Because I think that at least the way we use deliberation is built on duality. Like it's you have kind of this mind palace. And I think that there's something else going on. But I think that's not a super popular position because animals are quite sophisticated in what they can figure out.
Well, I'm all for digging into unpopular positions, so.
Yeah.
I love this. You keep coming back to this duality, so I want to touch on that real quick. You say in the part 3 post that we're native dualists who feel at our core that we're made of spiritual stuff, which I think is just true. I've never heard anyone argue with the assertion that is how we feel. A lot of people will assert that that's not literally true, and I think they're correct, but we absolutely do feel that way. And also you say that this seems to be binary. Either an organism does or doesn't have this feeling about themselves. Basically, you're saying that's what a soul is. That the word soul is an agreement between millions of people that the essence of a self, the seat of agency, this connection to the divine, that is the word that we use for that, the soul. I really freaking love that because you're saying that this is an account of how the human soul evolved. How'd you come up with that connection between the word soul and what we're talking about here?
So some of it goes back to the big five stuff where, the big five is literally like we experts could debate it and come up with all these factors ourselves, or we can basically just defer to the masses. So it's actually in a sneaky way very, very populist. I really prefer the word soul because that's what like 8 billion people have decided on needs explaining, or like what's different. I think it's much easier for, say, a dozen academics to kind of trip over themselves or to create technical terms that don't really capture the full breadth of what it means to be human, especially because that happens over the course of decades where soul, that word, had to survive for, I don't know, 50,000 years in various forms. I mean, there's a lot of research about who we are, like what makes humans different. And so they might say symbolic thought or language or all of these things. But I just think that you're kind of liable to trip over yourself if you're trying to find that out from the top down. And so I'm just like, hey, let's do a bottom up approach. We just kind of like we poll everybody, and then that's what we say needs explaining.
I know Wes would have issue with that. He'd be like, you're Spinozing, you're taking a word that means something magical and trying to turn it into a thing that is actually materially explainable. I personally like the word because I've been very much spirituality curious recently. And I do think that words like this point at something that at least feels intuitively important to being human, and we do need to talk about it. How do you disentangle the religious, spiritual, magic aspect of soul from what we're actually trying to get at when we're talking about recursion and self-consciousness and realizing that we exist in time?
Also a good question. So I don't know if it makes it better or worse. I grew up Mormon, and not only Mormon, but like pretty Mormon. Like in Utah, I went to BYU. I served a mission, which is actually where I stopped believing in the faith. I mean, mostly just in the specific claim that you had to be baptized Mormon to go to heaven.
It's surprising how many people lose their faith on missions of the Mormons that I've talked to.
So I'm not sure how anybody keeps their faith as a missionary. Because that was the problem. I mean, so it was like I literally never thought about Mormonism critically, for sure. Mm-hmm. Like I grew up in the most Mormon city in the world, in South Jordan, Utah. And then like as a missionary, you're just teaching a bunch of people and you're like, oh God, I hope that they don't ask like such and such question. And so you just start kind of like preparing for questions and you think like, yeah, there's no answer. There's no answer to that. So let's just hope they don't ask that.
And then you started questioning everything.
Yeah, but at the same time, so I have a pretty strong like background in esoteric Christianity because that's really what Mormonism is. A lot of people don't know this. Harold Bloom, he was actually a big fan of Joseph Smith. So Harold Bloom is one of the best literary critics of the past, few decades. He himself was obsessed with Jewish Kabbalah. And he wrote a book about the authorship of Genesis and particularly the creation story. He said that Joseph Smith somehow pulled from the ether the original religion or the of the people who were writing Genesis. He said, so he was a man who was obsessed with this. And he's like, yeah, Joseph Smith really did go back to the roots of Genesis. And so I have a decent background in that sort of Kabbalistic Christianity, particularly so the Gospel of John is, it's just really sophisticated. It's weird when you think about it that this is a Jewish book, but it's written in Greek. Like it starts out like in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was with God. He's just saying like, hey, all the things the Greek philosophers are doing, we're going to mix that in with the Old Testament. And then this is kind of I think of it as a parable, the Gospels. But it is, one of the reasons I use soul is because I think that the author John had a really, really good understanding of human nature and of particularly how humans are different from animals. And he spent a lot of time on what to do about that. But I also think that he deserves a lot of credit, or religion in general deserves a lot of credit, for understanding the difference between humans and animals in ways that I think a lot of academics get wrong. Because a lot of academics tend to, so you can read this so many times where they'll say, yeah, there's no categorical difference between humans and animals. I just think it's obviously false.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's another reason I wanted to use soul. And like I'm interested in what you think, like how to disentangle soul from some other claims, like say that the world is only 7,000 years old, or that you have to be baptized Mormon to go to heaven.
Personally, I almost don't want to bother if I'm going to join a religion or I don't know, try to corrupt an existing religion for my own purposes. I would want to join a religion that is basically full of secular people already who understand that soul is taken metaphorically and don't believe in any magic stuff. So this is why I'm much more okay now using words like soul and spirituality, because I know what they're pointing at, and anybody who I'm seriously talking about religious stuff with is also going to know that we aren't talking about any actual non-material phenomena. But that's difficult. Like, I think it would have to be somewhere in the in the foundational doctrine or the rites or something that this stuff doesn't actually exist, because I've now met a lot of rationalists, not a lot of rationalists, some rationalists and a lot of post-rationalists who are slipping back into the, oh, but actually magical stuff may exist and there may be, spirits and entities outside of us. And it makes me cringe, because I'm like, no, we left all that behind, and for good reason. And unless you have good evidence that you can use to support that kind of thing, let's stick to what's actually important when we're talking about what the human soul is, that we're talking about recursion and understanding of the self as an object that we can think about. So my main answer is to ignore it and only to have these conversations with other people who are on board with me in the same thing, which I guess maybe isn't a completely practical answer. But when you're talking with other people who do believe in the mystical stuff, as long as they understand that I'm of a different religion from them, then it doesn't matter if we have different definitions where theirs includes magic and mine doesn't, if we're both basically talking about the same kind of thing and can understand each other when we talk about the human soul.
That's basically what I was going to say. Like, I don't know that it's important to disentangle them all that much, because the claim that, like, I have a soul and the earth is 9,000 years old or whatever, those claims that's a huge jump from one to the other. But if we're focusing on, again, arguing, we just did the whole sequences on use of language and definitions and whatnot, but the idea of like this inner spark, the thing that makes me, and the thing that knows that is kind of the core. And I've never been hyper religious. Maybe you're good. You're Jehovah's Witness. Maybe this is something you could speak to more. But is that part of what was taught as like the magic of the soul? If you zoom out a little bit from what they explicitly were saying.
I mean, the Jehovah's Witness religion is interesting because they believe that the soul is material and that a human is a soul. Like, our physical body is also our soul.
What if you lose a finger?
It's fine. Your soul is still, in the core essence. Like Andrew says, at our core, we feel like dualists that have spiritual stuff. So if you lose a part of your finger, if you lose half your body, that's fine. You still got your soul. You are a soul.
It just seems weird to say that they're the same, but then say it doesn't matter how much of the body you lose.
They would probably say it's kind of like, if pressed on it, probably some kind of brain-centered thing, because people with brain damage would be, cured of the brain damage to become fully themselves again.
Yeah, they'd cease to be themselves.
You had some things as well about like how in the past you would not have liked this word usage in our notes here, Steve.
Oh, me. Yeah, I mean, just in the old days of the New Atheist Wars online. Yeah, we haven't talked about recursion much, if at all, yet, but
we should get to that right after this.
Yeah. No, just basically, I'm much more amenable to use of the word soul now than I would have been 15 years ago. I think it is perfectly appropriate. And while there might be some room for misunderstanding if, you don't explain where you're coming from, if you're just talking with a whole new audience, if you were to get up and in front of a congregation at church and start talking about the soul and from this perspective, you'd be right for misunderstanding, but it does not take that much effort to bridge anyone's use of the word soul with what we're talking about here. That's why I like it, as opposed to trying to talk about I, quote unquote, or the self. Those are easy enough, but they require some work. And, some people might differentiate that from like, well, I am also, my body and my personality and, my memories. And it's like, no, we're talking deeper than that, man. That's the soul, and that's the essence of what we're talking about here.
And I think some people just literally aren't equipped to make that deep of a recursive conversation about these things. But if there's disagreements on those things, like how can you believe in a soul and be for abortion rights? I'm like, well, in my religion, we believe that the soul enters the body around the 1 year mark of around the first birthday, right? My religion just has a different view of soul. We believe you can actually destroy the soul if you damage enough of the brain. So that's why it's so much of a sin in our religion to kill someone or to destroy their brain past recognition, because it would be a big deal if you could destroy a soul too, right? You can talk to people in their language that way. But usually you don't have to anyway.
Is that part of why you use that language, Andrew?
So, I mean, part of it is I've used language similar. I mean, I haven't gotten any religious people, or I don't want to equate that with magic, but I mean, you know what I'm getting at. But I haven't gotten a lot of miscommunication. And so I think going forward, partly because my audience is so kind of rationalist, that I think it's fair to use that. So I think that I'm a little bit more agnostic on some of the stuff. So recursion seems kind of magic to me. And what I mean by that is that you can't reject something like something about self-reference or recursion is involved with, say, the collapse of the wave function, right? So you can find Nobel laureate physicists who say stuff like that. So to me, that would qualify as magic. And I don't necessarily believe that, but I'm just kind of agnostic to it, and I'd want to leave the door open to at least that definition of magic.
Okay.
I can dig it.
Yeah. So you sent us, actually, real quick before we proceed here, you sent us a link to a draft of a post about, how do you pronounce the name of this temple? Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah, Göbekli Tepe?
Göbekli Tepe. Okay.
Tepe? I'm not sure. It's Turkish.
We got to see a draft, which I loved. It was so cool. I pulled out a few things from that draft as well. So people probably won't be able to read this just yet.
It's actually up now.
It is up now.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. Well, never mind. You can, and we will link to it. One of the things that keeps being almost a snare for you, I guess, not really a snare, but a thing you keep pointing out, there seems to be a lot of hesitancy on the part of academia to believe that this recursion, this consciousness could have diffused rather than independently evolved each time. One of the things you said here is that agriculture popped up in a dozen civilizations worldwide. Surprisingly, the academic consensus holds that this was independent each time. Cultural diffusion is really unpopular. Why is cultural diffusion really unpopular in the academic circles?
For the same reason that it's they tend not to use the word primitive or anything hierarchical, because it implies one group, and it's going to be Eurasians in this instance, kind of discovered something and then brought it to someone else. And so it would be bad news for a lot of activists, or it'd be, that is too strong, but it'd be somewhat uncomfortable if the rainbow serpent is part of the worldwide worship of snakes, because then it's not a specific Australian Aboriginal religion. But there's just so many problems with it being a pan-Australian religion, because you're still left. So Australia and Papua New Guinea 8,000 years ago were the same continent. And so if serpent worship goes back 50,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, why don't you also count the serpent worship in Papua New Guinea as being part of the same religious tradition? But that is deeply unpopular. So those are the general snags that in the academia they're very, very sensitive to.
So the problem is that if there was diffusion,
then somebody gets credit, and that makes it look like someone's better than someone else.
Well, but that's stupid. It's like 50,000 years ago. No one nowadays gets credit from what happened 50,000 years ago.
It is stupid, yes.
I agree. I think
Okay.
to steel man that case for, I guess, like how socially unfashionable it would be. There was that actually a real world example of finding that there was some finding about the prominence of Neanderthal DNA in modern Homo sapiens, and that you didn't really find any of it in people with direct African ancestry or something, or recent direct African ancestry. At the time that finding was published, there were comments about how unpopular it would have been if the opposite happened to have been true. You know, it would give ammunition to racist assholes, and the people who found this might be seen as giving them ammunition, even though all they were doing was just looking around. If it worked out to where the ancient Greeks, or the Greeks' great-great-grandparents, were the ones that first stumbled across consciousness and permeated it across the world, it'd be like, oh, so it was white people. It is. I think I lost my charity somewhere along the way, but I was trying to give the charitable steelman of it. But I think that's partly the concern. So in social science, that they're cognizant of that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean that's like, it doesn't even necessarily have to be white people. So at the time scales we're talking about, I'm not sure white skin even exists.
Right.
So that's a fairly recent selection. And so if the snake cult is spreading 15,000 years ago, then like there literally aren't white people. But there could be people coming out of the Caucasus Mountains or out of Anatolia or out of Siberia who could be spreading this, which still, I suppose, they would take issue with.
Like Göbekli is in the Middle East somewhere? In Turkey, maybe? Is Turkey the Middle East?
Yeah, Turkey,
It's the edge of
fairly
the Middle
close
East.
to Syria.
Okay. They should totally be like, check it out. The Middle Eastern dudes created consciousness. We don't have to blame the white people for everything. So basically, it's cultural diffusion is unpopular because it is politically dangerous to say that it could have diffused.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you guys follow Graham Hancock or various other kind of ancient aliens adjacent
I do not.
people. Researching this, I've ran into a lot of this, and it's just, I mean, the debates really are wild. Where there'll be someone who's basically doing an ancient aliens things like they find a lot of examples of diffusion. It'll be like pyramids, right? So there's pyramids all over. Like, what's up with that? They'll say like, and we think it was ancient aliens spreading this, and then if they get enough attention, the anthropologists are like, that's racist. And it's like the entire debate is just crazy, right? Like the reliance on aliens and then the rejoinder. The problem with that model is that it's racist. Like,
Right. Not
like
that it's
what
ridiculous.
what the hell kind of a debate is this?
Yeah. So you posit that it's possible. Not okay. Let's not beat around the bush. You think that religious innovation involving snakes came before agriculture, and Genesis helps track that through our shared myths. And you say that Judaism is an unbroken cultural chain back to Göbekli Tepe, which is freaking fantastic. And I love it, but I'm slightly concerned that I love it so much because it is from what I was raised in my childhood and what I already have a lot of spiritual significance attached to in my psyche. The majority of people, if we include India and China in the human population, which we should, don't have lineage that traces back to Judaism. Why don't their myths also follow this?
So those do as well, and it is a little bit. It has a little bit of an edge, but I like you could say the same thing about. So, for example, Navajo, they have a belief that their language was the first. I mean, many people have this, but that the world will end if they forget certain words. And I hope I didn't completely mangle that belief. But I mean, part of the reason I word it stronger about Judaism or Judeo-Christianity is that I know a lot about it, and so I can really defend. Like, I can actually define very well what Judaism is and my interpretation of the different texts. And then also, I think one of the big things that hangs up anthropologists is, for example, there's this guy, Chris Knight, who had a very similar theory of mine. So he thinks that culture came, it's the sex strike hypothesis. And he thinks that women banded together to deny men sex. And that the snake was the I guess the banner, but it was part of this. And so he thinks that there's a world phylogeny of denying men sex, and that is where culture came from. Is the women basically said, hey, we're not going to have sex with you unless you bring back a lot of meat, like bring home the bacon and then we'll have sex. And that is his model of how we became human. And he talks about it's a worldwide phylogeny, all of this stuff, but then he just talks about Aboriginal Australians, that they have preserved the best version of this, or the most accurate. And so it's a very long book, and he spends all of it, or almost all of it, in Australia. And I mean, come on, he doesn't know that much about Australian myths. He knows a lot more about Greek and Christian myths. He can do a lot more to interpret that, but he doesn't, basically because I mean, he really doesn't like Christianity. And so I don't know, I do it a little bit because I think I actually really like the New Testament, and also the people who wrote Genesis. I think that for the time, everything written in the Bible was, or maybe everything is too much, but I think it was very advanced for when it was written. And yeah, I want to give them credit.
The idea that women as a subculture of humanity unilaterally decided that, hey, we're going to have a global wide cabal of this new rule seems way less plausible than people getting cool hallucinations from snake bites. I
Yeah.
just on its face, that sounds like it requires a whole level of global subterfuge that just seems hard to imagine happening at the time. But maybe I'm not giving it enough credit.
So I quote it in, or it's in a footnote of the third version, and it's totally wild. So he says at the beginning, he says, "My interest in human origins is to prove that a Marxist revolution is possible." And like literally, and so he says that, like he's talking about the symbol of the serpent, and he says, "Oh, it represents subjectivity itself." And then he moves right on to it's the picket line, it's all of this. And I'm like, no, but like subjectivity is an interesting um, step in human evolution by itself. We don't have to go straight to Marxism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that seems like he had an axe to grind, which gives the whole thing a lot less credence for me.
Yeah.
But tell me if this is jumping the gun. But I do want to talk about the Eve theory of consciousness specifically. But
Let's talk about Venom
okay.
first, because I think that kind of there's a couple of things that you said that remind me of it.
Sounds good.
One of the things, so you said it's like on its face, it's more likely that snake venom hallucinations. So I was really going off nothing. I was like, hey, Genesis, it seems like a pretty good model. What's with this snake? And so the first, like, I just Googled, like, can you get high off snake venom? And I found some Vice documentary that you could. And then I found, like, there's a little literature. So I found actual papers where it talked about somebody who took snake venom. This is in India, and they had been addicted to opiates and alcohol for a decade, and they took snake venom on their tongue from a cobra, and they were just like kind of knocked out for a few hours. They woke up with euphoria, and they just cold turkey quit opium and alcohol. I mean, it's very similar to what you hear about mushrooms. And so the next thing I thought was, okay, then like surely they weren't just doing snake venom. Like they must have worked it out. Like if that's part of the ritual, they have to have used an antivenom. And that's very, very, very well studied. In the Proto-Indo-European, you fight a dragon, so Indra fights a dragon, and before will take some sort of drought that gives them strength to fight the dragon. So this is in Norse mythology, Greek mythology. There's a lot of times where this happens. So I was like, okay. And then if you look at apples, they have a lot of rutin and apples with snakes. So that's at least that's part of our iconography of Genesis. And then also it's said explicitly in the Hercules story. So there's a lot of rutin there. If you look to Dionysus, he's holding a scepter of fennel, and that also has rutin in it. So the first like quote unquote snake oil or panacea was actually literal wine and snake flesh that were boiled together. And this goes back 2,000 years ago. It was said to be a cure-all, and wine has anti-venom properties. And so you can see, like, okay, maybe there was some sort of ritual that combined some anti-venom and snake venom. And then if you look at the etymology of snake in Hebrew has to do with divination, and particularly libation, which is a liquid offering. And you can go back 6,000 years ago, and it's like all of their libation, their bowls that they use for ritual, they have snakes on them. Dozens and dozens they find. And this is in so many different cultures. This is in Iran. This is in the Mesopotamia and the Near East, Anatolia. So it's quite widespread, going back a long ways. There's the linguistic support from the etymology of snake, and there's also a play which was written by the father of Greek tragedy, the libation bearers. They almost put him to death because he revealed part of the Eleusinian mysteries in these. And David Hillman, who I referenced earlier, he says, no, the part that he revealed was that they were using snake venom as their entheogen. So there's a scene where a snake bites the priestess's breast, and then her milk and the venom become a libation that they consume, and then they, I don't know, they see God or whatever. I was going off basically nothing. And so to say a little bit about the scientific method. The scientific method actually has a lot to do with fantasy. Like you create a hypothesis, you create a model, and sometimes I mean these are just like in economics it could be like a mixed linear model or whatever, and then you find data, you fit it to the data and see okay which of all these models works, and so it was a really surprising thing to get right. That it does seem like in that neck of the woods venom and anti-venom were used. And I haven't seen anybody really push that. Like the classicists, it's weird that they don't do anymore. Like they'll usually talk about it in Greek, in the Greek context. But there are, to this day, there's gurus who drink snake venom and talk about it in strictly entheogenic terms in India. So it seems like kind of a Proto-Indo-European or even more if you include the in Genesis, which is outside of the Proto-Indo-European canon. It's one of the things I keep coming back to. So people are like, no way they were getting high on snake venom. But I don't know, what's all this? Really, what is all this?
Mm-hmm. I really like that in your the latest post on Hercules, you trace the Hercules myth fairly closely, I think, to the same Genesis myth that there's apples from a woman and eternal life and forbidden fruit and a snake in a tree. I like the post. I think people should read it. And it seems like you also have a significant background in the Greek classics.
Zero background. This is literally the last year I've read a lot of Greek classics.
I think we need people who are deeply steeped in Indian Hindu tradition, people who are steeped in East Asian traditions to like read your stuff and go back and comb through their own histories and be like, this works, and then contact you, and you can put things up on your blog about like, look, this is how it works from other cultures for people who are already familiar with them.
I would love that so much. I am very open to linking any such project.
Absolutely. Real quick, and we'll cover this again at the end of the episode, so people have two places to find it. But how can people reach you if they do have anything to add?
Go to vectorsofmind.com. It's the easiest. Or just Google Snake Cult of Consciousness, and hopefully my blog comes up and not the Bayesian conspiracy.
Pretty sure it'll be your blog first. I really hope. And there's like a contact page or something on there.
I'm trying to think if I have my email. Nobody's reached out on email, but if you subscribe, you can just reply to the subscriber email, and I get those.
Excellent. Or probably even just comment on a post right now. Are the comments still low enough volume that you can follow all of them?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. I know eventually a lot of people reach a tipping point where they're like, there's just too much coming in every day. I can't keep it up.
That is not this day.
Okay. So the main thing, and we covered this in our episode, is that recursion happens once you introspect and you identify with the voice within you. And that is how the soul is born. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I do have a something to throw out there that is too early yet, but I keep forgetting it, then remembering it. So I want to just plant it, and we can circle back to it if we get time. But I like the Eve theory of consciousness. I think you make a fun and compelling case for it in this post, which, again, it's the Eve theory of consciousness 3.0. It isn't clear to me why Eve it's sort of the preservation of the ancient memory of in the context of the post and possibly in the context of real life. It's the preservation of the memory of where consciousness came from, and that's where that story comes from. What I'm trying to get at is it's not clear to me then why. Maybe it's just a aberration of the original intended purpose of the myth or something. But Eve gets a lot of shit, and it was punished for this rather than rewarded. And it's not clear to me why that would be the case.
As does consciousness, right?
I actually think you made a very good case, or maybe this is my own prejudice coming through, but like consciousness really sucks if you're coming from a point of pre-conscious, just animal existence, where now you know of yourself, you know you're going to die, you have a lot of alienation, because when you don't understand that there's a you just kind of feel at one with everything. Like a lot of people experience this and comment about it when they're on psychedelics, that you just feel at one with the universe, and you don't when you're sober, because there is this separation and you're alienated and you're forever alone. And you even pointed out in this in the part 3 post is that realizing that you are in a fixed point in time that there is a past and a future is just further alienation. Like now you're also alienated within a time stream, and it's beautiful and it's heart-wrenching, and I think it goes to everything that sucks about being conscious. And I can totally see why people would be like, why have you cursed us with this knowledge? We were dumb and happy before, and now we're stuck like this. We can't go back.
Yeah, but now we can plan for winter and, hang out with each other in a way that we couldn't before. I mean, so there's a lot of pros too, but that's a good that's a good point.
It helped us take over the planet, right? It is a survival thing that helps us spread our genes and is very adaptive, at least to our environment, but it's also painful. Lots of times pain is adaptive. It'll make your genes spread further, but it sucks. This is a comment I have at the very bottom here, which I wanted to bring up later, but animals can totally feel pain. Like, we see them feeling pain. And this is one of the reasons we don't want to torture animals and we hate factory farming and all that. But I really don't think animals can suffer in the same way that humans suffer, because they don't exist in time. They don't exist separately. They can feel pain and be hurt by it, but it feels like you need a soul to really have.
I mean, so the upside is that there's pleasures that are also unavailable to animals that we
true.
experience.
Yeah. Do you think we're better off? Not in terms of reproducing and taking over the planet, because obviously in terms of survival, we're better off. But do you think, like, on a personal, individual well-being point of view, are we better off? Or would it be better to be never sober if that was possible?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Have you read Unsong?
Yes.
I mean, it's the problem of pain, right? So I like how I like that Scott is so concerned with that. I think so. I'm a big fan of the axial revolution, or the axial age.
What is that?
800 BC. You start seeing basically all over Eurasia with the Old Testament, the Greek philosophers, Buddhism, Confucianism. They're taking all of the old, all of the old myths, and they're being self-reflective about them, and creating a whole new type, I guess, ideology or thought. I think that they might have kind of figured stuff out 2,000 years ago.
We just had Brandon Hendrickson on the podcast a few episodes ago, who argued that this was in large part due to the diffusion of literacy, especially among the thinking classes, and the ability to write down all the thoughts and then look back on them once they're written down as a more coherent whole, allowing recursion upon ideas using the tool of literacy.
And that definitely makes sense, that your best ideas would be had after writing, that you could kind of look at everything. But my personal beliefs that I don't believe strongly enough to write about. I'd like to learn more about Buddhism and all of the other axial age philosophies, because I know that at least those people thought that they figured out the problem of existence. And so that's really why they wrote the New Testament. And it's remarkable to me that the Bible, it's written over 1,000 years. And there's a beginning, middle, and an end. If you think about just the Old Testament, it's kind of weird. It's kind of like, well, life sucks, and this is our lot. Also, that there's no personal morality. It's your morality is a covenant between God and the Israelites, and it's mediated by a priest or a prophet. And so we're just working in all of these new ideas from Greek philosophy and elsewhere, that no, it's about following the golden rule. It's about the spirit of the law, all of this. Basically, your own salvation is your relationship with your own divine spark. I really like the way they presented that idea in the New Testament. And I wish I knew more about how Buddha presented kind of his solutions to the problem of existence.
Stephen, did you have any? I'm briefly curious also what you think. Would it be better to be not sober and not conscious? Because it seemed like you definitely are on the pro-consciousness wagon here.
Yeah, I think we touched on this last time, and I gestured something, happy pig, sad Socrates. I think that the pros outweigh the cons, and the cons are huge, but so are the pros.
In terms of well-being, though, you've been really high on acid before. Do you think if you could just be like that all the time and not know that there's a sober self, that would be almost preferable?
When one's that high on a psychedelic experience, the question, would I like to be like this all the time, isn't a question you can ask yourself, because there's no self to ask. Like, and that's kind of at the root of what we're talking about. There, are you asking, would it be better to strip away the I? And
Yeah.
I disagree.
Okay.
And partly you just said too, in terms of well-being, you posited that animals can feel pain, but they can't suffer. I think that they can suffer non-physical pain. Dairy cows cry for their kids when they're taken away. They have some attachment to them, something probably akin to maternal love. Some proto version of that, and they are in distress when they can't care for their offspring, and likewise the offspring cries for their mom. But to the extent that you can, if you want to say that animals can feel pain but they can't suffer, I would also say that they can't experience well-being.
No, that's a good point.
Again, I challenge that they can't suffer ways other than pain, but even if you want to just like more tightly constrain that, I think that you also can't flourish without recognizing, my plans came to fruition. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at how well my offspring are doing.
Right? No, I agree absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that that true well-being requires that sort of stuff.
No. All right, you have convinced me.
I'm not exactly settled on that, but that I feel pretty strongly about it.
No, like the highs of seeing your plans come to fruition and feelings that satisfaction are definitely worth the consciousness in the long run.
It feels like intuitively that would be more satisfying than, like I was at your place really high on mushrooms once, and because of a back thing, my left leg doesn't cooperate without a modicum of conscious attention. So like you guys wanted to go for a walk, and I'm like, well, that's not happening. I'm going to stay here. I felt very accomplished for not pissing myself laying on your couch and eventually making a cup of tea. Like those were like the smallest, levels of achievement that one could hope for a base human. And they felt really significant to me. That feels like I'm missing out on higher level experiences, right? If I feel, peak satisfaction for managing to find something to drink, which might be what it's like to be a wild animal,
Yeah.
But
kind of wonderful.
Well, I mean, so wonderful, but the peaks are so much lower than the peaks that we get from being able to have real reflective thoughts and ambitions,
Yeah. And this is why wireheading is bad. Shots fired. Okay. You were talking about the division between your conscious and subconscious mind is that which you can and can't introspect. Right. We were talking about introspection and recursion. That is a fascinating insight, which is obvious, like when you point it out, but I hadn't thought about it before. I often am very cranky with my subconscious mind because it feels like there's this stupid freaking animal living inside of me and it can't communicate with me and I can't communicate with it. And I'm like, dude, this is my own body. This is my own like psyche. Why can't I tell myself to relax? And I'm like, no, I'm going to be tense right now. And I don't care that there's no reason to be tense. I'm going to do it anyway, is what I'm imagining my subconscious is saying, but I can't talk to it. And it feels like wrestling with an animal a lot. I've managed to accept this and, I've been told by my ex-partner that like, you got to treat your body like an animal and you got to be soothing with it. And, like you would with an animal. And that's a good way to think of the subconscious. But like, why is there this division? And I'm assuming this is the division that was brought out by recursion and the recognition of I, right? Like, why is there only a part of us that is conscious and accessible to introspection?
Yeah. So I think that part of what makes this difficult is that consciousness both seems like the absolute base of cognition. So it's about, planning to walk somewhere or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it also seems like this thing which was built on top of our lizard brains, right? And so that's what makes it so weird, is that it's this prefrontal cortex is where the higher level stuff is happening, and then it's also like the not the brain stem. Where is it? Anyway, the base of the brain, where the lower stuff is happening. One weird thing is that the shape of our skulls in the last 30,000 years have actually changed more on the base than in the prefrontal cortex. And
Huh.
so it's one of those weird. So I mean, this is very speculative, kind of spitballing.
Hmm.
But I really am just a dude on the internet. Um,
Hmm.
it seems like once you get recursive self-awareness, that it really could change kind of the basic object planning, or at least the wiring where, like how that is connected, the two parts of it.
So you think the fact that we have a consciousness, we have been altering our subconsciousness over time and actually changing how it interacts with the rest of us?
Yeah, I think that must be.
Which means that we could already be significantly different in our brains than our ancestors even just 10,000 years ago through this feedback process.
Like, there's just so many human ailments which are bizarre, like chronic pain. I'm not
Yeah.
sure animals have chronic pain. And like a lot of people have I don't know, fibromyalgia or something like in that
Hmm.
group. It's just very strange, right?
We just did an episode on chronic pain and similar ailments, and there are compelling cases that it's largely psychological. You know, not to say like there aren't animals with crippling injuries that hurt all the time, but
Right.
that's different than idiopathic back pain. You know,
Yeah. Can we do anything about the subconscious? Is it good that we have a subconscious that we can't introspect?
Yeah, I don't have much to say about like what to do about it. That's so one thing. I think my experience with Mormonism wasn't great, and so I really prefer very old kind of ideologies or religions, partly because they can't pander to me, and so like
Mm.
I feel a bit more protected if I'm reading, say, the Upanishads or the Bible. Like I would say, probably look there about what to do about it. Like people have thought really, really hard about
Yeah.
what to do about it.
It feels like a lot of religion is about like how to manage your subconscious. In an ideal world, would you personally prefer to be like an entirely conscious being, or do you like having a subconscious element to yourself? Which I guess is
Ah,
totally off topic, but now I'm just curious.
yeah, so I was with somebody and they were tripping on shrooms and they forgot how to breathe. And that looked very
Oh.
uncomfortable. And so I hope, like, I would not ever want breathing to be part of conscious experience.
Mm, yeah.
So I think that there has to be a lot that's outside of consciousness.
Okay.
I had a similar interaction with somebody. They called me while they were on, I don't know if I forget what psychedelic they were on, but they were in a bathtub, but they were at a party with friends. And the friends called me because this guy wanted to talk to me. And he was saying he forgot how to breathe. But I was like, but you are breathing. Like, yeah, but I have to do it. You know, it's like,
Hmm.
and there was a panic there that, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be in charge of the beating of my heart either, you know, like, but that's not the same thing as like me having competing desires to do things, and some of them are higher order cognition than others. You know, I so on the one hand, like it'd be nice to be more scrutable to myself. You know, why am I in a bad mood or something, right? But you can kind of already, at least to the extent that for questions like that, maybe if I thought about this question longer, I'd think of better answers. But you can kind of get past a large part of the problems of having a subconscious already, and then what's left is kind of like this just mysterious fun, you know, like to put it in a maybe in Inyash language, you know, you're dancing at the club and there's a woman that's alluring and you can't quite put your finger on it. Isn't it fun not to be able to put your finger on it? Isn't there kind of a fun mystique to wonder, you know, if your subconscious was immediately able to communicate to you in articulate ways of, oh, well, it's exactly this, you know, that there's some loss of that mystique, you know.
Yeah. I want to pull this out from your writings because it relates directly. You say, with self-reference, our animal drives become fractal symphonies of yearning and imagination, which I guess is what we're talking about here, that we can feel these different things pulling us, even though we can't control that they're pulling us, and it makes for a much more complicated, interesting existence.
Yeah, I think that's partly why art was so good from the beginning. So it's one
Mm.
of the mysteries, like why 40,000 years ago humans start making art. One explanation is that humans had been making art for a long time and just none of it had survived. So maybe they were making baskets, which were really great. Who knows? But it's really weird that there was no narrative art. And then once it comes, it's like, wow, that's like that is a great mammoth that you drew on this cave wall. And it seems like you just get some self-referential loop on top of all of the previous drives you have. That, I mean, that really is, it's that self-referential loop is where art comes from. And because the drives were already fully realized, you get basically fully realized art from the get-go.
That's awesome.
So the rest of that line goes on to say, "Is Buddhism actually evil? It seeks to it seeks to eliminate yearning/desire, return us to pre-Eve, and nirvana is a literal extinction." But
So
I bring that up. Hold on, just to say, because this goes back to what I was saying about why is Eve vilified. You know, if she did a bad by awakening humanity, then Buddhism is the savior, right?
The rest of that line is my commentary that I was going to now.
You didn't italicize it. Okay,
I should have. Yeah. So I guess I do wonder about that, because Buddhism is or at least the parts of Buddhism that have become popularized in the West, is the trying to eliminate all desire, right? Because desire is the root of suffering, and it wants us to return us to a pre-Eve state where we don't desire anything. Is that so?
Well, I guess I already answered.
Isn't that actually talk to a Buddhist about this?
Okay.
And I already gave my answer, so.
Yeah. Like the idea that of nirvana being where you just stop reincarnating. It seems like if everyone were to reach nirvana, we would literally extinct the human species.
I mean, to the extent that you think existence is pain, then maybe that is the good thing. But
maybe
yeah,
so.
that sounds like a question for a real Buddhist.
Well, in that case, I will not ask any of us, because we are not real Buddhists.
I have a tangent to jump to if we're looking for something.
I have a number of things, but I've been talking too much. Stephen, hit your tangent.
Well, real quick, maybe this is an interesting question or not, but Andrew, have you had any profound experiences on psychedelics? You certainly write like someone who has, but you don't talk about, at least in the posts I've read, any personal experiences.
Yeah, I mean, not so profound. I mean, the most intense, I thought I was a non-playable character for a while, and so I just had a nice evening as a non-playable character. I was up in the woods. But yeah, so I've had a few experiences like that. It's more just a sense that that this conscious layer is quite fragile. I think that's most of what I got from it. I do think I am optimistic about a lot of the therapeutic interventions that use this and all of that. But I personally haven't benefited that much, I should say.
The most profound thing that I was able to remember and take out of an experience was it's hard to say crystallized or refined, because nothing is that articulate in this state of mind, but a better understanding of communicating. You know, I mean to say something, you guys mean to understand it. I think I understand your understanding, and you think I understand my understanding of your understanding. And so it was very recursive thought, but it was at the specifically just the idea centering around communicating ideas. But yeah, I didn't have any life transforming experiences that were like, I need to do this with my life now, or anything like that either. But I certainly find the experiences valuable, but I wouldn't necessarily say wholly indispensable to my life.
I wanted to hit a few bullet points. I realized just now we've been going for almost 2 hours, which is like, holy crap, that went fast. One of the things you wrote here is that we built a map of our mind, and the map became the territory. We exist inside the story that the brain tells itself. I love this framing. Does that make it feel like reality is partially illusory?
Yeah, so I wrote that line partly because I don't want to capture just the consciousness market. I want to capture the consciousness is illusory market as well. And partly because I don't think the theory is about necessarily the hard problem. Like it's about, okay, there's something that changed. There's some structural difference. If you think it's an illusion, then sure, where does that illusion come from? And so this is my model of where that illusion comes from. And then we can kind of talk about if it's illusory or not.
Ooh, is it okay if I title this episode Andrew Cutler Solves the Hard Problem of Consciousness?
No, that is not okay.
Damn it. All right.
Well, I think, were you saying that's not a problem, or that's not a good title?
I think he was saying that is not a good acceptable title.
It's great clickbait, but yeah.
And it's true, but
Well,
okay.
Well, it's fun because the "we exist inside the story that the brain tells itself" links to a YouTube video that I haven't watched, but it could well have linked to "The Elephant in the Brain" by Robin Hanson. The idea that our conscious mind is only aware of the stuff that our as he puts it, our press manager puts together for us.
Yeah, I haven't read The Elephant in the Brain, but I read Religion and Politics Divide Good People. Who wrote that? It's the guy who's really connected to Heterodox Academy.
I know the book you're talking about. Was it Height? No.
Yeah, it was Height.
It was Height.
So
Okay.
I read it, but there were a few. Anyway, they're very, very similar books, and that was hugely influential. I hadn't considered those things before when I read it, I don't know, 5 years ago.
For what it's worth, I found The Elephant in the Brain to be the most digestible and enjoyable Robin Hanson reading I've ever read. And I got to tell him as much when we did an episode with him. And he gave a lot of that credit to his co-author of that book, whose name I'm now failing to recall, and I apologize.
Kevin Simler, is it?
Yes. Perfect.
Nice. I like the idea that the brain is the thing that actually exists, and the brain is just telling a story at all times, and our consciousness, we're a character inside the story, and we're the main character inside the story, which explains a lot about us, honestly. But Andrew, because you also came from a religious background, you're familiar with the idea that we are all just thoughts in the mind of God?
Not super, actually. Is that a bigger part of Jehovah's Witness?
No, it's not actually. I don't remember exactly where I got it, but it has its roots in some sort of Christian.
It also seems kind of like Indra, too.
Oh, okay. It could be. I don't remember where I got it, so maybe it is. But I've always loved that because, I mean, honestly, we could be like whenever we dream, we are the god of that entire world, and everyone within it is just thoughts in our dreams, and we could all be thoughts in the mind of God, I guess, in theory. But in this, if you think about it this way, like we are literally, our brain is the god. There's 8 billion gods walking around, and we are just thoughts inside of the brain of a god, which is, I don't know. I personally love that framing, and it is maybe because I'm too much of a hippie.
Well, Andy wrote a whole book with kind of that premise.
Well, yes.
Check out What Lies Dreaming by Ignash Brodsky.
But the premise came first, and then the book was just, added later. Sometimes you want to explore things like that.
What do you think about the name of God being I am? So I am that I am is one of the names of God. So I really think it's because we were forged out of the same stuff that we now call God.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's this it's all the self-referential spark.
Yeah, I think it works perfectly. That God was talking to us before, and we didn't know any better, and then we realized that God is the I am, and then we have the knowledge that the gods had. It was fantastic, and absolutely that's why one of his names would be I am.
I always love interpretations that would that I love, because I like that a lot too, but it has the added benefit of like totally being worthy of getting you burnt as a heretic 500 years ago.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful framing that I'd never come across like that before, and I think it's I found it to be just really exciting. Again, younger me would have been turned off by the religious talk, but there really is no separation of it. Religion is as old as people, and this is partly an explanation of why, if not entirely the explanation.
Speaking of being burned at the cross for being a heretic, you say that Christ on the cross symbolizes a serpent, which blew my mind. I have no idea how this is the case. You continue to say, but you could go your whole life as a Christian without knowing this. Yeah, I don't know this. Can you explain how Christ on the cross symbolizes a serpent?
I link to a BYU, or someone at BYU wrote an article about this, but I had just grown up knowing this. It's part of the esoteric Christianity of Mormonism, but it's also sourced in the New Testament. And so I believe it's in Matthew where they talk about how Moses lifted a serpent up on a cross, and that Jesus is that same. So he's this that's a type of Christ.
Neat.
It makes sense that would be metaphor, because a cross would be really the wrong shape to use if you're going to try and crucify a serpent.
I do now put together a lot of Christians saying that you have to drink the blood of Christ or be washed clean in the blood of Christ. And if he's similar to a serpent, that kind of tails back to drinking serpent venom as a hallucinogen.
Yeah, I mean, maybe so to say a little bit more about I guess, ego death versus kind of the program of religion.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think the New Testament, like kind of the answer to, okay, so you have an ego and you feel alienation. A lot of it is ego death by other means than psychedelics. So turn the other cheek. I mean, it's basically these rules of maybe open individualism, like basically treating other people as if they are you. So love your neighbor as thyself, first love God. Like even the Sermon on the Mount is kind of it's the non-psychedelic way to deal with ego. I think it's a pretty good program. I mean, so there's people who write about Christianity that maybe it was also, at least parts of it were a psychedelic cult. And that's people like Murarescu. He wrote a recent New York Times bestseller, and that's one of his arguments.
This is interesting. I know some number of Satanists at this point, and like their big thing is being in rebellion to Christianity. Like they don't actually believe in Satan, but a lot of it is about the veneration of ego and individualism. It now makes so much sense that they are literally the anti-Christianity if Christianity is about killing the ego and subsuming yourself in the whole. And they're like, no, we are the anti of that. The ego is important, and we need to be sober-minded, non-ego killing, non-falling back into the mass of the rest of society.
Yeah, so I mean, what's the scripture? Something like, he who shall lose himself shall find himself, something like that. But it's basically like to live, you have to die first. Is kind of they're hitting you over the head with the whole crucifixion thing.
Yeah.
Where I mean, so to say explicitly, like you have to take upon yourself the Christ. You have to take upon yourself the cross of Christ. I mean, he is the example.
Die first, kill the ego. I don't know if I've experienced it because it still seems like such a strange concept of ego death, but a lot of people say they get ego death under psychedelics. It's interesting because we were just saying how we don't want to kill our ego permanently, and yet it seems to be an important part of many religions.
The other thing, too, when you mentioned that you don't know if you've experienced it, is when you're experiencing it, you can't be aware of it. It's something you look back on and realize, at least in my experience, you look back on and realize that happened, but you can't exactly have the thought, I don't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think that thought, but you can't kind of subconsciously verbalize that thought.
Andrew, have you ever seen the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion?
No, I haven't.
Okay. It was a formative anime in the history and still considered like a huge cornerstone in anime, but spoilers for something that's over 25 years old now. Ultimately, it's a story about reverting all of humanity to a pre-Eve consciousness, like just merging back into one. And it actually has two endings, a happy ending where the main character accepts this and merges into the full pre-Eve consciousness gestalt, and a sad ending where he rejects this and is left back on the shores of humanity as an individual in his own body, and with most of humanity having moved on past him, but has extremely heavy Christian themes all throughout. There is Lilith, there is Eve, there is the angels are the enemies that are always coming to humanity to try to reunite our consciousness. Maybe in some interpretations, there's a lot of interpretation you can put on this anime, but I thought of this when you quoted Joseph Campbell, the writer of the hero's journey, that there's a primary polar tension of consciousness of duality against an earlier but lost knowledge of unity that is still pressing for realization and may indeed break through under circumstances in a rapture of self-loss. And I want to rewatch that anime now, thinking explicitly of the Eve theory of consciousness and our early human roots. And it seems like we still have, like we aren't all the way evolved yet. We still have this pressing on us and calling for us to come back. Do you think maybe in another 10,000 years we will get past that, where there isn't even a desire to return to this pre-Eve level of consciousness and we are fully self-realized individual, satanic temple type humans?
Yeah, I don't know where it's going in the future. So I mean, could just be AI takes over the consciousness. I mean, there's so like there's 10,000 years is such a long time frame. You can't really say much. I tend to think that we like we have to ride the tiger of
Hmm.
consciousness.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the, like there's a lot of people who are like want to return somehow, and that's a lot of, especially like end day religions, they really want to return.
Hmm.
Some branches, like some types of Christianity. So for example, I was listening to Jordan Peterson. He was interpreting uh, Genesis, but he was talking with like a Christian apologist mathematician. And he was really, I mean, labeling a lot of people as Luciferian. So people who are too scientific, right? And so basically they're too uppity in what they think humans can know, Luciferian, right?
Yeah.
And at least in that instance, how Peterson was using it, like I'm pretty Luciferian, that I think Lucifer was the good guy in that story, as was Eve.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's what I mean by riding the tiger of consciousness, that like we really don't know the future, but we can't go back because literally we have evolved. And so like we're stuck with alienation, and there's just something we have to like, it's something we have to work out ourselves.
The future of spirituality may be this battle between the people who want to revert and the people who want to either advance or further alienate, depending on how you look at it. Do you think the getting extreme levels of recursion and losing the gestalt consciousness, or not gestalt, but the combined consciousness makes humans less adaptive once we can control our own fertility because we just don't reproduce anymore?
So I agree with your caveat, once we can control our own utility. So I think recursion is obviously just um, completely overpowered as a strategy
Mm.
for taking over the world. But yeah, I mean, if you have an essentially hedonistic ideology, then that will override making like have forming a family.
Unless you can show people that having a family is the most satisfying thing.
Yeah, and there's not really, I don't see anybody trying to do that. So it's that was one of the largest parts of culture shock moving from Utah to Boston. Was it, like there's just so many little things where it's in Utah, like that's the family is the most valued thing you can create. And so just something like complaining about kids crying on an airplane, you're not going to do that, or it kind of raises some flags.
Mm.
Whereas in Boston, that's a very normal thing you'd say, like I didn't sleep because there's some kid on the plane or something.
So for a Mormon, complaining about a kid crying on a plane would be like a person complaining about black people being on a plane. Like, you
Not
just
exactly.
don't do it. Oh no.
Yeah, I mean
Okay.
it's not like you just don't do it, but it's a lot of, that's the example that came to my head. But a lot of things like that where it's just you give parents a lot of you give them a break a lot of the time within Mormonism, and you
Mm.
don't like you just don't see that like outside in the great collapsing fertility of the secular world. And so I think you need a lot of social tech like that if you want to have a fertile community.
Mm. Well, I want to end on the AI thing. You've mentioned the AI a couple times in our conversation. I keep skirting around it because I wanted to save it to the end here. The line I pulled out from your writing is, "We have an n=1 example of the emergence of general intelligence, and we're about to build another," which sounds very ominous. Where would you like to start with the AI discussion, I guess, before I introduce my own biases here?
I think we should start with you introducing your biases. So I don't have very strong opinions on AI, surprisingly. I just bring it up because it's something I'm interested in general, but I actually I don't have that much unique to say, at least yet, I think.
Do you think an AI could rival us in any way before it develops recursive thought? This, like we have the ability to think of an "I am" existence.
Personally, I don't think consciousness is an illusion. I think it's something like base level physics would be my guess. I mean, I that's not a very strong belief. And so yeah, to be alive, I think that you need that. And so I think if AI had that, there'd be just a bunch of emergent characters, and yeah, it's a new life form. That's a little bit different from, is there some AI which can kill us? Because like you don't need to be
Yeah.
conscious to kill. So there are some like dangerous paths that don't include consciousness that could be more computational.
It sounds like you think in that case, as long as you get a large enough, powerful enough brain, once it reaches a certain magnitude, it seems like you have the feeling it will attain recursion naturally? It won't necessarily need to stumble upon a ritual or something?
No, so I do think that there's probably some like different architecture. If you think that consciousness is a computation, then it's just we haven't found the right architecture yet, and then you could get the right architecture. Or if you think that it has to do with some like quantum effect, whatever, then it's not the right substrate that it's built on, but it could potentially. So yeah, I think that answers the question.
Do you think consciousness requires recursion?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Do you think it would be possible to build an AI that doesn't have recursive thought, even if it is technically far more powerful than our brains are?
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely in narrow. So like obviously that's already true of chess, for example. But I think like it could just be, yeah, maybe it's a P zombie or like an S zombie for a silicon zombie. Yeah, I think that's definitely possible.
Okay. In that case, it could be theoretically controllable. It would be more like a tool, in which case our main worry would be like people not either misusing the tool or accidentally making the tool destroy us by giving the wrong commands, but we wouldn't have to worry about an AI having its own goals that it pursues if we can make it so it doesn't have any recursive thought.
Yeah. So like I actually do think I think Genesis and Prometheus and all these myths are actually valuable in understanding the transition. I would love to write more on that at some point, but really it's very, very amorphous ideas so far.
You think it's important for AI researchers to have a decent background in old religions that cover these sorts of things so they have some idea about what to look out for, what to avoid?
Well, I definitely think it makes Rune a better AI researcher.
Would we like to say anything about Rune?
Oh, he just has a lot of great tweets about I mean sometimes very ominous tweets. So he'll be like, "Oh, we didn't become human until we rebelled against God." And so like he definitely frames it in I don't know what he knows better, the Christian or Indian tradition, but he talks about both a lot.
What are you expecting or fearing about the emergence of general intelligence in Silicon? Like you work in AI, right?
Yeah, but not on the architecture side. I use taking AI and just applying it to medical problems.
Okay.
So nothing too foundational.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I can add anything that your listeners who have read Scott Alexander wouldn't know. I mean, sorry to disappoint. Maybe if you give me some more specific.
When you use these the tools that you work with, do you ever see things that make you think, there's an inkling there that if someone were to really pull on it, they might be able to go somewhere with it in terms of building a thing more like us?
No, not really. So like most of the scares of like, oh, it's self-aware, I thought were not very good. So an excellent example of how Christianity doesn't help inform the debate. There was that Google engineer, I forget his name, but he basically said like, I'm a Christian and this thing told me it's conscious, and so I think it's conscious. I know I didn't find his reasoning very convincing on that. I'm really interested in science. I think AI is going to get really good at science really fast. Part of this is because like I've had to pick up like a lot of the Greek stuff and like look into linguistics, all of this other stuff. And AI is just going to have all of that. And it's going to make generalist connections, which I think is kind of the next, like that's where a lot of the frontier is, on very generalist ideas. And I think it's just going to be incredible. I do think that there are, in the next couple of years, there will probably be some recursive algorithms, even if it's just two bots kind of asking each other questions back and forth, like kind of devil's advocate or Socratic method or something, that really, I don't know, let's say the Eve theory of consciousness is true, that could independently get to the Eve theory of consciousness.
Oh shit! So they could accidentally ladder up into recursive thought.
Yeah, or at least recursive scientific discovery or debate. But I do take some issue with the word thought, which I think requires consciousness.
Okay. So it isn't thought yet. You think they could recurse upon themselves, accidentally start recursing upon themselves to discover self-consciousness?
So I think that comes down to whether consciousness is a computation. So that particular framing. So that's from Roger Penrose, and so
Mhm.
he's one of the guys who's he got a Nobel for discovering black holes. He thinks consciousness has something to do with quantum mechanics.
Okay.
So if he's right, then no, you can't just have you can't have self-referential computation and get there. If Penrose is right, like one of the things, so if you polled physicists, they might say, no, that guy, he's got like Nobel syndrome or something, where he's just
Mm.
being goofy now that he
Mhm.
can. But there's a lot there's a lot of really top level physicists who have said similar things, and so I think we should at least be agnostic on that front.
Is the claim there then that our brains have some quantum magic that, say, a silicon based brain can't?
Yeah, so that's I want to read more about his kind. So I haven't read his book yet, The Emperor. Something with the Emperor has no clothes. But it's I haven't read that yet. So I hope that I don't mangle his claims. But he wrote a follow up book with anesthesiologist that made that claim. He said that there's got to be some sort of quantum effect, and maybe it's in the microtubules in the brain.
Interesting.
So like he goes all in, which is I like that.
Yeah.
I admire
I've
that, even if I'm not sold yet, but that is interesting. I'm interested enough to want to check out what he wrote about it.
I've heard about the microtubules thing. It seems like hand waving to me, but I'm not a quantum physicist. To me, like, I wouldn't be able to judge anyway, so I'm staying agnostic on that front. But doesn't that contradict your primary thesis here in the Eve theory of consciousness, that what gave us consciousness is when we looked inwards and discovered ourselves through recursive thought?
Right. So is my does my claim necessarily imply that it's a computation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think your
I,
claim doesn't. I think your claim is
yeah,
that
I think
we
no.
looked in
Like it,
and we woke up, but not that anything that looks within can wake up. If don't let me put words in your mouth. I get to actually ask you. So
yeah, I mean, so about that magic stuff. So how literally should you take the Eve being the mother of all living? I mean, so let's say that looking inside actually it changed the microtubules, whatever, and that there's some quantum effect that was first the self-referential paradox first experienced by Eve. I think that that kind of still works, right? It could be an illusion or it could be some base physics thing, but it could still evolve either way.
Hmm.
See, this is the thing. We're 2 hours in, and now we're getting in things that I first I haven't written about this because it's like I think it's not as useful, right? So like I think you should like I really think you should just treat it like there's some phase change. We want to see when the phase change happened. Here's a model, and then you start asking the more crazy things. But
Okay.
what I'm trying to communicate is I'm pretty agnostic about what the actual change and like how deep does this go, right?
Yeah.
And I really think that it calls for that. And also, I don't want to represent that I've read so much of Penrose or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
but there's a whole class of, hey, it's not an illusion. There's really something strange going on here. And I think that we should take that seriously.
Okay, so the Eve theory may be necessary to bring about this phase change, but it's not sufficient. There might also be quantum effects that interact with all of this.
Yeah. And like maybe the quantum effects are in the microtubule. So you see, hey, does snake venom affect that? And yeah, it does.
The snake venom affects the microtubules?
Well, so the reason he wrote it is was with an anesthesiologist. So it's various like ketamine affects the microtubules, for example. Like that's how anesthesia works, or that's at least one of the pathways. And
Huh.
so yeah, I mean there are some papers where I was just Google Scholar microtubules venom or the different pathways they uses. So the nicotine pathway and their effects on those parts of the cell.
I want to say, oh, there might be quantum effects in silicon too. I don't know, but at that point, we're just getting to random bullshit that I'm pulling out of my ass, so I will not do that. So you have at least a possibility that there would be no way for a silicon-based life form to be conscious. Like, not necessarily true, but if this is true, then they could never get to consciousness.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's kind of like testable. Like you just I don't know. We'd have to learn more about human consciousness, which is for surprisingly under researched. I mean, because it's kind of hokey. It leads you to snake cults and strange areas like that.
Right. Well, that's bad news for some of us who are hoping to upload at some point in the future. But maybe they could still save all the important information and just transfer it to a different meat brain when I need to switch bodies.
It's the happy ending of Neon Genesis. You just join the great cosmic ocean of
Yeah, I think the trouble with the the upload thing would be, even if you got an uploaded me, it would probably say it was conscious, but then it might just be an S zombie, right?
All right.
Yeah, we'll have to find the way over that bridge before we get to it. Hopefully.
was there I think Steven might have wanted to ask something about Eve or about is that true?
Yeah, we touched on it though already.
Okay.
About the pros and cons of waking people up. Cursing people with the knowledge of death is the same thing as gifting them with the ability for true love. So,
Aww.
I think that question is sufficiently answered. Now I'm trying to ponder the equivalent of snake venom for computers, but not being a quantum physicist or a real computer scientist, I'm not equipped to tackle that question. I'm a web developer. I fully own the fact that I'm not a computer scientist. So, anything else you wanted to? I always want to ask. Anything else that we didn't ask that you wanted to mention, or anything like that?
I'm curious what you guys think doesn't work. Like what are the parts that really raise your eyebrows?
I'll let Eneasz answer while I think of something articulate.
I have a number of notes that we never quite got to because we kept talking. I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. We went all over the place, but I wanted to ask you about the Seven Sisters and about bull roarers because you touch on them and they seem to be like a big deal for you, but I don't know why necessarily. Like you mentioned several times that Seven Sisters are mentioned through many cultures, but there's only 6 of them, and the 7th one is missing. But then that just kind of hangs there and doesn't go anywhere. And also with the bull roarers, that like this is probably a tool that was used to help men gain consciousness by women. And I wanted more on that too, but maybe you're still like in the process of writing more about it. It didn't have the nice ending. There was no New Testament to the bull roarers to wrap it up.
I think that's just an issue. I mean, what I wrote was 30,000 some odd words.
Yeah.
Which is way too long. And so I actually really I tried to be very economical and not include a lot. But so I think I say for statistical reasons, the easiest example of diffusion is the Seven Sisters. And so why I bring up the Seven Sisters is just because it's the shortest example that's really compelling. You can't really argue against it. And so there must be important parts of culture that have diffused the whole world because there's this one story, Seven Sisters. And so there's also, like, I linked to another article which I cover like 5 different similar things, but none of them are as statistically compelling or as short. And then the other one I bring up, bull roars, is just because that's physical evidence of a ritual diffusing over the whole world that is basically accepted in anthropology. I really haven't seen very many people say no, that this was independently. I mean, so some people say that, but usually it's, hey, we don't like to admit that the diffusionists are right, but hey, this really looks like it diffused. And you can find a ton of different answers like that. And so also I think it's a good example of kind of my treatment or relationship with anthropology, which is they have a lot of evidence which could lead them to the ideas that I'm presenting, but they're basically too biased, or they're not interested in who we are and where we came from if it involves diffusion. And so those are the things I was trying to communicate with those 2 examples.
Okay, that's interesting. So you think the bull roarer is like unique enough of an artifact that it wouldn't have been independently discovered like a dozen times or however many it has?
Yeah, and I include like 2 quotes at least to that effect.
Okay. I really love the mythology behind the bull roarer too, that it's this almost like a magical artifact that when it's constructed the right way will wake up men, but then also it fucks them up and they have to kick women out of the space and for whatever reason. Like it's just the coolest idea, and I want it expanded into like a greater story narrative thing for my own hedonic pleasure.
I mean, so be the change you want to see in the world, right? Write that sci-fi.
I just jam, maybe. All right.
Put it on the backlog. I'm trying to think, is there anything that really didn't work for me? I mean, it paints an awesome picture that is, and this was true with the snake post on its own too, that like gets disconcertingly more and more plausible the deeper you get into it. I certainly don't have enough knowledge to be like, oh, but there's this big hole you're missing. I mean, the closest I could think of is more addressed in this post than it was in the snake one about why did it take snake venom to wake up our ancestors but not us. And I think you basically hit that here, but yeah, nothing else really jumps to mind.
How often you keep showing snakes being everywhere and how much sense it makes that venom would be an athenogen. I liked, especially like the part where you said, let's rewrite all the myths so that they're about mushrooms, and that Mother Mycenae was, gifted things in South America, and the Great Shroom Field or whatever gifted people in Australia, and you can see cave paintings everywhere that have people with mushroom heads on them, and you're like, if we found this everywhere in the world in this time period, it would be completely plausible to say that psychedelic mushrooms were used in the very first versions of early shamanism. But instead, we find that with snakes, and yet no one is willing to say that venom was used. It was a very powerful point.
Yeah, and if people read it, I had a lot of fun making those pictures with Midjourney.
Yeah, love Midjourney, man. All right, I think we should probably wrap it up. Where can people find your stuff, and how can they contact you?
Vectorsofmind.com, and then just leave a comment. There's not too many. I'll see that for sure. Feedback also is really helpful. In this, like especially in this stage of the idea, where it's a hypothesis or theory, and it's at this point out of one person's head. And like you said, especially if you're from some other tradition or if you speak some other language than my native English, that would be super, super helpful.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for talking with us. Thanks everybody for listening, and for the people that help them out. Thanks in advance, man. You guys are awesome. I love all this stuff.
Yeah, this was great.
Oh, I mean, one last thing. It really has been a pleasure. You asked great questions. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I again, when we talked about the first post, I had no suspicion that you might hear it, and then the chance to get to talk with you directly about it was a pleasure on our side too. So, if you're amenable, we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, we went for a long time today.
We really did. This is far longer than I anticipated. We should maybe have broken it up into two, but
we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Bye. See ya.
Bye.
Stephen, welcome back.
Hey, Nash. Welcome back. It's been no time at all.
None whatsoever. That was a really long episode.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Ask Who at patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI made an audio version of it for everyone to listen to, which is linked to at the top of the post and will probably be released on this feed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the Eve Theory of Consciousness Part 3, the one we mostly talked about. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a 3-hour long audio file, it looks like.
Yeah, it's a doozy. I appreciated him going through the work to make it. This would have been easier to read easier to listen to than to read, I think, for me, for parts of it, for sure. So anyway, that's available for everybody. Thanks, Asku.
Okay. Now we have other things.
Yeah, you had a thing in here, and you pulled out a line from the notes that sex rewrites the boundary of self. And then your note was, why though?
Yeah, I guess that was a thing that, like, it jumped out at me. I think this is true. Don't you find this to be the case, that sex rewrites the boundary of self? Especially, like, I don't know, it seems to loosen the boundary a bit at the time of having sex, and then it resettles into a place which is often similar to where it was before, but sometimes, maybe not quite.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess it's not exactly sure. I'm trying to skim at the context of it. Let's see. I think it's talking in the context of, I guess, lots of sex stuff. This is bullet point 6.
Yeah, it's part of how many sacred ceremonies or initiation ceremonies, at least in the past, I guess probably not so much anymore, included sex.
Yeah, I mean, and part of that makes sense. Sex feels good. It's cool. That was a whole minor subplot part of the Da Vinci Code. It was the sex cult in that. Okay. But rewrites the boundary of self. Given the way that they talked about that self was discussed in the post, I'm not sure if it definitely doesn't rewrite I, but I mean it can. All right, let's grant it. I don't mean to belabor it so long. Just making sure I understood the context.
Okay, well, yeah. I guess my question was like, but why? And we didn't get around to asking it because the episode was so long anyway. And honestly, I don't know if he would have even had an answer. It just seems like one of those things that like has major effects on our psyche.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And I don't know why that should be. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any good case for why it should be, but it does seem to be the case, right?
I guess I'm still struggling to know what we're talking about. Like, I'm definitely more entwined both physically and mentally with the person I'm with, at the time. And I mean, and that makes sense. There's probably something not entirely dissimilar to having a really good doubles partner in tennis or something, right? You move as one unit or something, but this is a different kind of thing.
No, maybe that is what it is, that it is the flow state that you share with someone else, and like feeding back and forth between her state and your state, and reacting to each other and making something together like that, not in a fully conscious way, but in a flow statey way, that if you manage to hit the rhythm just right, does harken back to that ancient time.
That seems sufficient. And there's definitely something too about something in our deep monkey brain says this is the most important thing I can be doing. So
right. And oftentimes there's like a flood of hormones afterwards, which also helps resettle things. Totally. Yeah. What was the second part?
The second part said, why is this easier for women? And I'm not sure what this is.
Of getting into that state with sex. It seems that like women have a much easier time of becoming lost in a sex flow state than men do.
I didn't know that.
Well, okay, so I have had not quite a few women partners that I've actually gotten into flow state like that with. I've had a handful of, right? So I have a more than N of one for women, but I only have an N of one for men, which is myself. And it seems to me that it's easier for women to find that flow state and lose themselves in it than it is for me. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe I have a harder time of reaching that flow state than most average humans do. And if I were to compare myself to an average guy, then I would be like, oh no, I guess guys can reach it, at the same rate as women can. And I'm just weirdly deficient in that way. But it does seem like it's hard for me to get there. And it doesn't seem as hard for the partners that I've been with to get there.
Maybe this is half pun, half Freudian slip, but part of the explanation might be in the word that you used twice there was hard. There's an amount of focus that a guy typically has to do. And the thing is, I guess I've never asked about, what was the flow state kind of, I always check in how things are going and how they went and stuff, but I've never asked, was that a lose yourself kind of experience, or, were you in your head a lot or something? Maybe I should ask that. But just speculating. If I had to guess and generalize, I imagine part of it is the effort to maintain the sex for longer because, like it or not, it's not over, exactly, but it's a good shelling point when a guy is, why am I being so flippant, so dodgy about this? When a guy orgasms, they hit the refractory period and all that stuff kind of stops working for a minimum of a few minutes. And it's like, it's at least a break from that current act. So there's kind of a pressure to stay focused long enough to maintain that for longer. So maybe that's part of it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's sufficient. I was mainly just curious about the note in there, and I didn't want to leave it hanging. So
maybe there is some method out there, some ancient sacred teaching of how to be able to get into that flow state easier with both partners. And if anyone is aware of such a thing, I don't know, let us know. I would be interested in that because the times that I've hit it, it's been really great.
If I had to guess, I think it's just like take all the pressure off.
You can't ever take all the pressure off because...
I mean, the thing is, like, if it becomes a goal with a success state, then there's like something to focus on, right?
Right.
But if you're just there vibing, then it's just about the moment. Although, like most things that involve anything of the whatever contemplative or meditative dimension, it's a lot easier said than done. So,
okay, thank you. I think you have helped me get at least one thought straight on this matter.
All right, how fun! I'm glad I could help.
Hell yeah! Well, let us quickly talk about our friends at over at the Guild of the Rose.
Yeah, they're an organization that teaches real life rationality techniques and not just whatever rationalist stuff like you find in the sequences, but broader strokes for just winning at life. How did Matt put it during the world's first ever in-person class on Sunday?
Shit.
Was it systematized winning? But
No.
that's too common. Yeah.
The term was success engineering.
Thank you. Yes, I loved that.
Yeah.
Success engineering is a fun way to put it, and a very rationalist way of phrasing it as well.
Yes, and sounds better than systematized winning, I think.
I think so too. It definitely still sounds our flavor of nerdy, but it's a new flavor, so I like it. Between last episode and this one, I've signed up for a proper account on theguildoftherose.org. I've been a subscriber / patron or whatever of it for months and months. But now that I'm in there and messing with the path system and assigning myself tasks and adding experience, getting experience points, it's actually a lot of fun. And I've been saying like, hey, this would be a lot of fun. Check it out. Now I'm speaking from personal experience. And I also really appreciate that there's the pragmatist path, I guess what we'd call instrumental rationality. There's the empiricist path, which we refer to as
epistemic.
Epistemic. Thank you. Yeah, I knew it was another E word. And they have the meditative path, which is kind of just for like the more holistic everything else.
The post-rat rationality.
That's kind of what I would say. But as this demonstrates, if it makes you better at life and a happier self, it just counts as falling under this umbrella, right?
Yeah, it's just rationality, but that is the branding that it has taken on, that it's post-rat.
Yeah, well, I'm fine to challenge the branding, and it's not like I don't even feel bad about just subsuming it into what I call rationality. It's like like the first double-blind experiments. If someone was like, "Well, this is post-science. This is a new thing that adds on top of it that's better," it's like, no, we're going to just make that science now.
Mm-hmm.
This is now part of the scientific method.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just doing that with everything that works for the goals of rationality, to the extent that the goals are being right, winning, or being a better self. Anything that does any of those things, I'm putting under the umbrella. Fight me. Anyway, huge fans. Check out Guild of the Rose. Speaking from personal experience, I haven't joined a cohort yet. But and if that's one thing that's kind of impeding you from starting as well, there's a lot you can do just solo. All the course material is there. The path system is there for you. Some of the, to unlock some of the things along the path that involves working with your cohort. But anyway, check it out.
Yeah, you might get in a cohort with Steven.
Guildoftherose.org.
And link in our show notes as well.
Yep.
Alrighty, let's go on to the less wrong posts.
All right, the mind projection fallacy. This one is one that I think is quick to communicate and one that was easy for me to remember. I reread it for fun, but
and it wasn't the one that I thought it was. I was thinking of the
typical mind fallacy.
Yes, I was thinking of the typical mind fallacy,
which is related.
It is,
yeah,
but not quite.
And I loved his example. The ye old science fiction stories where it's got a big green alien monster carrying away a hot girl in a torn dress, and it's like, why is he taking the hot girl? Why is it taking the hot girl away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because the authors thought that the alien would think that she's sexy. It's just like sexy is a property of her, and that's a thing that things like. Did I do that right?
You did that right, but I kind of have my doubts. Like, obviously, I didn't meet those authors or cover artists or whoever it was, so I can't interview them and ask them. But, like, that is such a... Maybe I'm typical minding again here by saying that is so dumb that no one could actually think that. I am more of the opinion that the sexy lady on the cover is there for the benefit of the viewer, the audience. They know that a human male is going to be looking at this, and so like the alien probably just grabbing the closest human they can. They're like, that human looks tasty, I'm going to run off with it. In this particular instance, the closest human was a woman with a torn dress, and in the male viewer, that invokes more feelings of outrage and protectiveness than if it was like a guy or something. And so that's why that alien taking that person was chosen as the cover. But I don't think that the person who made the cover was thinking the alien thinks that she's sexy and the alien grabbed her specifically because she's sexy and it's going to ravish her. It's just the human that the alien happened to grab.
Yeah, I think importantly, Yudkowsky, I think, explicitly says that the author didn't think that the alien thought that. It just didn't even occur to the author to think what the alien thought. But I think you make a good point. Like King Kong, whatever, grabs the damsel for the hero to rescue or whatever, and she happens to be pretty because she's on TV or whatever. It could just be a device for the viewer, and it's not like Kong found her sexy or something, right?
In this post, I think Eliezer is specifically saying that the alien is presumed to find the woman sexy as well, because he comments that oddly enough, the aliens never go after men in torn shirts. He does quote that the person making the cover would probably think, therefore, a bug-eyed monster will find human females attractive. So I do think that that is what he is saying specifically, and I think I would wager that he's probably wrong. I don't know.
At least in some cases, he's got to be right.
That's true. I guess there are some really dumb people out there.
Well, and for all I know, this I maybe if we reversed image searched this picture that's in the post, it would link to a story that's explicitly about I'm going to take her to ravish her or something, right?
Right.
I'm sure that shit exists. So
Yeah,
some authors were that. I don't want to use the word dumb at all. Just they weren't thinking in that on the level of would this actually make sense, right?
Were they though, or were they just the Chuck Tingles of their time?
It's hard to say.
Okay, that's fair.
We'll have to find some, but more. I think generally though, the mind projection fallacy it is, and this is in the post as well. It generalizes as an error.
Right.
It's the kind of thing that it's the argument above the real meaning of the word sound.
Yeah, that you think what exists in your mind is a thing that actually exists out in the world.
Right. And this gets it when I try to phrase it too much differently, I just start leaning really directly into the next post about the quotation is not the reference. So I'm down to just jump to that if you want.
Let's do it.
All right. He tries to paint it with a few fun examples. Well, a few examples. Your mileage may vary if you think they're fun, but I don't know, which example do you want to start with? The Morning Star, or maybe the A and B.
Yeah, A and B is, I think, a nice place to start, where he says in classical logic, the operational definition of identity is that whenever A equals B is a theorem, you can substitute A for B in any theorem where B appears, which is true. Whenever you see 2 plus 2, you can replace that with 4. And wherever you see 4, you can replace that with 2 plus 2. They're identical.
Yeah, legit. I'm with you so far.
Okay. That doesn't generalize to beliefs, which is kind of what the mind projection fallacy is about, that if the morning star and the evening star are both Venus. So if you know that, you know they're the same thing. But if the person who doesn't know that wouldn't necessarily know that they're the same thing. And so the morning star and the evening star are two separate things for them. And you couldn't necessarily, if you're talking to them, replace one with the other and expect for there to be a coherent communication, because they wouldn't know that.
Right. And this is, part of typical minding, maybe, tangential to mind projection fallacy, assuming that we're talking about the same thing when we're actually not, right?
Yeah.
You could sub in, if you squinted even harder, maybe the word sound, and have that debate this kind of way too, right?
I mean, I almost think that one of the easier ways to display this is that some people just think that certain types of sex are gross. And they obviously when back in the 50s, gay sex was gross, right? That was just the gross kind of sex. And it didn't occur to people that some people think it's actually really fucking hot because they're gay. They would just think what is wrong with these weird perverts that like gross sex? And it's that it's not a property of the sex. It's a property of the people experiencing it, whether they find it to be gross or not gross. Like the sex itself isn't.
Okay, yeah.
As long as no one's getting hurt.
Right, yeah, for sure. That makes sense. What I'd like to hear about his next example was, because then he talks a little bit about typed and untyped programming languages, but he says, here's a simpler version. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. And so you can put all that in parentheses. And if you want to run it, the reason I was distracted a moment ago is I just opened up the console in the browser here, and you can just write JavaScript directly. And what I had to do was just monkey with a smidge, because he's just using equals instead of equals, which is the syntax that 1 equals is assignment, 2 is checking for equality. And you can actually just cut and paste this, adding those extra equal signs, and it comes back true. So yes, all right, valid, right? What's fun about that is then what he tries to get at is the quotation is not the referent. If you want to make sure that we're not confusing what we're talking about, we can put quotations around the things that we're talking about. And the fun thing that it was just a nerd thing that jumped out at me is that if you put quotes around 2, 2, and 4 and true, it doesn't come back true. Because you're comparing strings at that point and not numbers.
Right. Yeah.
And so as a matter of, computer science and of thinking, it comes back false. I thought that was just kind of a fun little thing. But
That is really cool.
yeah, so trying to think of like the other main points to hit here.
Well, the other thing that he says, like with the quotes thing going, the morning star in quotes is like a belief about that star. It's the morning star. And he says that's not the same type of thing as the morning star, because the morning star is the planet Venus. So like the object, the morning star is the planet Venus, but the morning star in quotes is a belief that someone has. And they may or may not know that that star they're looking at is Venus. Those two things, in quotes and the actual object, are not the same thing. Beliefs are not planets. Beliefs live in brains. Planets live in space.
Yes, I like that, and that's an important tool to keep in mind when assessing your own beliefs, because you're less attached to a belief than you are a state of reality, right?
Yeah.
And this is a helpful technique that's been around for at least 15 years in the community. Is, if you're having a semi-heated discussion with somebody, you could write down the actual thing you're discussing on a sticky note and just put it right in front of you. And we're talking about that. We're not talking about each other. We're not talking about, other things surrounding this. We're talking about the specific claim, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it helps not just keep your eye on the ball, but it helps keep things from getting like personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that idea, that the talk about the claim or the belief. He quotes Tarski here, in the Litany of Tarski is a famous one among rationalists. That I think the whole litany is, I wish to believe that snow is white, if and only if snow is white. He quotes here, snow is white, in quotes, is true if and only if snow is white, not in quotes. So in quotes, the belief snow is white is true if and only if the object snow is actually white, basically.
Right. Yeah, I like that. I also just like when he reminds us that he's funny, because when he's talking about comparing beliefs to planets, like this is just hammering home the map territory distinction, but in a way that's coming at it from a different angle. So I appreciated it, but also I appreciate his humor. He says it's immensely helpful when one is first learning physics to keep track of one's units. It may seem like a bother to keep writing down, cm and kg and so on, until you notice that A, your answer seems to be on the wrong order of magnitude, and B, it's expressed in seconds per square gram.
Awesome.
And yeah, so it's like, it's important to keep your eye on the ball and be mindful of the thing it is exactly that you're talking and thinking about. So the notion of truth is quite different from the notion of reality.
Ooh, in what way?
Well, saying something is true compares a belief to reality. Reality doesn't need to be compared to anything to be real, right? Like,
I agree.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, again, when put that way, it's kind of like, oh yeah, duh.
So true applies to beliefs.
Right. Only beliefs can be true or false. Reality just is real, right?
Yeah.
True is a statement of my mind, not a statement of reality.
Right. And the statement in your mind can be true or false.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, he says, remember this next time someone claims that nothing is true.
I haven't heard that in a while, but this was during the heyday of the New Atheist Wars, so that was going around quite a bit.
Yeah.
Good times.
All right. Well, for next time, we will be reading Qualitatively Confused and Reductionism.
All right.
Stephen, one other thing I wanted to talk about before we move on.
Sure thing.
I was reminded of this specifically because of this whole snake cult thing. When we did the snake cult episode, we talked for a little bit about internal monologues and like, do you actually hear a voice, or is it like aphantasia? Like a week after we released the episode, some people in our Discord were talking about that, and they're like, do you hear an inner monologue? And then like a week or two after that, I started seeing it on Twitter, and like recently there was, as I referenced earlier in this episode, there was a sort of some discourse on internal monologue, like, do you actually hear words and stuff? And I'm like, is it a coincidence that that weeks after we released the episode, this filtered up into broader discussion, or do we just have a bunch of really interesting and influential listeners who also latched onto that and talked about it themselves for a while, enough to the point where it escaped containment?
Well, I mean, nothing's a coincidence, right? So,
yeah, because nothing is ever a coincidence.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like, your other podcast, the Mind Killer Politics podcast, where you never think it, but every major world leader listens to it. And it's not clear exactly how they found it, but they did. So,
good point.
Yeah. No, it's there's also a name for this effect that I should Google one of these days. When you first discover something or it's on your mind, you start seeing it a lot more.
Yes.
So there could be some of that going on as well.
Okay.
And of course, the conversation of it happening in Discord is no surprise that it came out around the same time as the episode, right?
Right. Because you would expect that.
Right. But on Twitter,
I mean, some of our listeners are on Twitter, obviously,
Yeah.
and some of our Discord users are on Twitter, I mean.
Totally. Yeah, no, I mean, so it could well be that's, and I have no idea what the scope of the conversation was on Twitter or how broad and big it was, so I'll take your lead on that. But it seems like about once a year for the last few years, I hear some major, or some popular new context talking about aphantasia. And I'm not sure exactly why and why it seems to repeat at some frequency. And I think this is a related thing where some people just straight up don't have this, and others have it to a higher degree.
Right.
And then many people are somewhere in the middle of like, I think in words sometimes, but they sound like me, unless I'm explicitly imagining somebody else. But still, it doesn't sound like anything. I know what a sound sounds like, and this is just me imagining a sound. What are you guys even talking about? So I think these things just kind of come in cycles, and maybe it was just good timing, or the world listens to the podcast, and we've got a wider reach than we thought.
I mean, some people in the world listen to the podcast, so that's something.
That's true. Very special someone listens to the podcast this week, or this episode actually.
Oh, yes. This episode, I'm assuming they are also still listening because they are a patron. We have to thank SXP as our patron of the week.
If you meant something else by that spelling, that's on us for not getting it, but it's, maybe it's S by P, like how you say whatever, width by height or something, or S times P, but SXP.
Yes. Thank you so much for helping contribute to this podcast. It keeps us happy. I like being happy.
Me too. It's great. It's kind of, one of the main whole things of life, right?
Yeah.
We've expressed this before, but again, the content's free. I do reach out to every patron. If I haven't reached out to you personally, let me know. And, or I guess ping on, message directly on Discord or on, you can message me directly on Discord. You can message directly on Patreon or comment on a post or something. But anything that we can do for listeners, we try to, whatever you'd like. But for the most part, no one wants anything, and they just are supporting it. That means a lot. So
it really does.
I never find a good way to articulate this. I should find like the best way and then just write it in the notes so I never forget. Maybe I can record it once and just paste it in every time. But
oh man, that would be terrible.
I know. It would be so impersonal.
Yeah. The whole point is people hearing us stumble around and acting like fools.
Thank you. Insert listener name.
No.
Yeah, no, fuck that. Anyway, yep, you get a personal, awkward thank you every time. So
awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you, SXP. And thank you, Stephen, for joining me.
Yeah, man, likewise. This was fun.
Heck yeah. All right, we will see y'all in 2 weeks.
Sounds good.
Bye.